What is the #1 single trick that's going to make the biggest difference in taking a beginner animation to the next level? That's what I was asking Satomi, one of our most skilled animators. A lot of people send her their animations, some wanting to join our show, others looking for advice on how to improve. She saw a pattern in those animations that kept coming up with each one she saw. The answer she gave me is what I'm making this first chapter all about. My name is Michael Huang, and thank you for joining me in this graphy. The animation you just saw uses the techniques you're about to learn, and they're what this first chapter is all about. This graphy is made with the assumption that you can use Adobe Animate at a basic level. You know the layout of the program, you can create symbols, and you know what tweens do, just things you can learn from the manual. But if not, that's still okay because it should still be possible to follow along. Let's go. Now, the way this chapter is going to go is that instead of me giving you a million rules to remember from the start, we're going to sketch out a not so perfect animation, and then I'll give you a set of tips to take it to a much more impressive animation. First, you're going to make sure you have the standard BFDI assets file by going to bfdi.tv/assets, which has all of the original BFDI character art and a lot of outdated art from episode 1. It's basically unchanged since we uploaded it in 2012. Now, if we go over to the library, we're going to see 4 folders, and the one we care about is body parts. And that's what has all of the character bodies, the arms, the legs, the eyes, and the mouths. Now, everything we're about to do, you can definitely do with, for example, blocky body. You can totally use these assets here, but for just this graphy, I've made a grandfather clock asset, which you can also download from the same webpage, but you really don't need it to follow along, it's just here to look cool. Now, we're going to start by making a layer for each of the body parts that we're putting on the stage, so that each symbol has its own layer. And that's because if you're using tweens, which we definitely are, you're going to want each layer to have one symbol. Or Animate's going to give you this, or it'll put a tween 1 in your library and generally not do what you want, so 1 layer per symbol. Now, usually my way of ordering the layers is to put the face, which is the eyes and the mouth, on layers which are right above the body, and the legs go underneath. Then the arm that's closer to the camera goes at the very top, so it's in front of the body, and then the arm that's behind goes in the back. And that's just the way that I usually set it up. Now, each symbol that's on the stage has its own transformation point, and you can drag that point to anywhere that's on or off of the symbol. That's the location that the symbol rotates around when you're tweening it, which makes a pretty big difference in the motion that it makes. So when you're placing the arms and the legs, drag the transformation point to the base of the limb. Or, pro tip, you can double click it to reset it to the registration point, which is the plus-shaped location that it gave the symbol when it first created it. So the same with the legs, double click and double click. Now we can actually play with these as if they're real limbs and like this is a real shoulder that's attached to my body. Similarly, these here are real limbs. And we could drag the bottom edge of this to skew it, like that. Similarly with this. We have now set up our character. Now to make this guy move. Before we do anything, let's put this body symbol inside another symbol. And we're going to do that by using modify convert to symbol. Though personally, I think you should use the keyboard shortcut F8. Like, I truly believe this, enough that I built this custom keyboard just so I could always have access to press F8, instead of having to go to modify convert symbol each time. The keyboard didn't turn out so well. I wish it did. Anyway, let's name this symbol body container and make sure that type is set to graphic. Okay, now in our library, we'll see that body container exists. Now we're going to add motion by adding a keyframe. So for all of these layers have just one keyframe at frame 1, and all of the normal boring frames after it are sort of inheriting whatever the first keyframe was containing. But you'll see that if we select a single frame across all of the layers in our character, right-click, and go to Convert to Keyframes, then each layer now has a keyframe that can store something new. Now we could make whatever changes we want to, and the first keyframe is still holding whatever it used to. And all the normal frames after the new keyframe are inheriting from it. Okay, let's just undo that. So we're going to rotate the arms to give them a new pose, but this guy's arms are already raised. So we're gonna go to the first keyframe and just bring them down. So even though our playhead is not on the keyframe, since it's modifying one of the boring frames, we're just editing that first keyframe. So now we have one keyframe where the arms are low and one where they're high. But we're going to add a third keyframe somewhere in between that marks the start of our motion. And what I did just there was use F6, which is the way that cool people do it, just like that cool keyboard. Anyway, in case we don't have everything selected, we're gonna press Command A or Control A to select everything. Then we'll right click one of these selected frames and hit Create Classic Tween. There we have it, our first object animation. Now those are two arms that are rising over time. Now this guy looks pretty dead. Dead in the body, dead in the eyes. So there's more we can do. If we switch to the transform tool and rotate the body a bit, we can give him some more motion and just to make him look more alive. But now the legs need to stay attached to the body. So we're gonna select them by drawing a rectangle and dragging the top edge of this. But since the feet are sliding like this, we're gonna hold Alt so that the opposite side stays in place. Now this guy is really moving. You know he means it, but his face is still dead. Let's make the eyes change over time. Making sure that the playhead is somewhere after the last keyframe, we'll select one of the eyes. Go to the Properties panel and find the button Swap Symbol. Now we've got a whole bunch of eyes to choose from, and we're gonna choose one of the surprised eyes. And do the same thing with the other eye. Lastly, we're gonna move the playhead to the start of the tween, so to this keyframe. And similarly, use Swap Symbol to change these eyes to eye closed 2. Now look at this. Congratulations, you've made your first object show animation, or your second, or your third, or fourth. Now what we're gonna do is make this guy's movements look so much cooler. We have a basic animation, but what is it that's so unnatural about it? Let's go back to our story about Satomi, our lead animator. What pattern did she see in those beginner animations that fans sent in? The single thing that they could benefit from is easing. Easing is an essential tool that's useful for two reasons. It matches the real-life physics, and it makes it possible to use a certain trick we'll learn about later in this chapter. But about the physics. Think of a car's speedometer. As a car goes from stationary to 60 miles per hour, its speed gradually changes. That is to say, before a stationary object can be fast, it has to start slow and get there over time. If this speedometer were to suddenly snap to 0, something's gone very wrong, and you should probably call an ambulance and maybe a few other organizations. In other words, with animation, you probably already know that you need to continuously move something a little bit each frame from point A to point B. But if you want it to actually look smooth, the speed that it moves also has to be continuous. So if you want something to move smoothly, it can't just switch from stationary to moving. And if it's slow, it can't instantly move fast. And if it's moving in one direction, it can't instantly change directions. So smoothness requires speed to change gradually over time. But smooth is only one of the ways motion can be. If everything is smooth, that's not realistic either. Back to our car example. We know that the car starts stationary and then over time uses its wheels to push against the ground and give it more speed. Then the tree takes it away in a split second. All the way up until the moment it makes contact with the tree, the car's speed is increasing over time. We can even see that the way the speed changes over time says a lot about its physical properties. You'll find that almost every natural motion changes in speed over time based on the forces that caused it. The more hints you can give the viewer about the weight, the shape, the softness, or whatever, the more real you can make an animation feel. And in an artistic way, varying up slow and fast movements just makes things look more interesting. Back into the animation world again. In traditional animation, a motion that starts slow and ends fast is called a slow in. And in the digital age, ease in. And the other way around too. So fast to slow is called a slow out or ease out. Now, this is in no way a rule, but almost every natural motion that doesn't get interrupted by a collision is going to ease in and then ease out in some way or another. I guess it's just natural. All forces come to an end eventually. Now that we know what easing is, back to our animation. First, let's go to the frame where our tween starts, select all, and then switch the Properties panel to Frame. Now, this is the tweening panel, and this is the section that we care about. Right now it says Classic Ease 0, which means constant speed all the way through. What we want is for our character to start slow and end slow, which means we want an ease in-out. Animate gives us a whole collection of ease in-outs to choose from, but we're gonna go with cubic, which is a good middle ground between smooth and snappy. We'll just double click this and already it looks so much better. We can even select these frames and just drag them a bit to extend it. And now we can really observe how much more lifelike it is. But there's more we can do. Let's say this guy is throwing his arms out with such zest and enthusiasm for life that he can't control himself and he throws them too far before pulling them back. Let's do that. We'll just select another frame across all of our character's layers and convert to keyframes. Now we're going to go back and make this original movement even more extreme. So he's raising his arms higher, and he's leaning back further. We might even move him up. And now you can see the legs are not attached anymore. So while holding Alt, the legs should be stretched and skewed to match. Now we'll select all, create classic tween, and then change this to a cubic ease in out as well. Boom, now it looks more natural. And the best part about tweens is that you can change the positions of the endpoints, you can change the timing, and they'll recalculate so that they're always smooth. And to finish it off, we can use the same technique to add a lead-in motion, just to give the viewer some extra time to perceive what's about to happen. Let's just select these frames and move them over a little bit to make room for a new keyframe. So this new keyframe is our new starting point to our motion, and the second keyframe we're going to make a little bit in the opposite direction, so leaning forward a bit and with the arms lowered. We're going to do the same thing to add a classic tween that has the cubic ease in out. And there we have it. And that is a reliable template for making a motion look a little more dressed up. Now that looks more natural, but I'm noticing the feet are actually shifting around a bit. And that's once again because of this thing. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom corner. And that is a pretty reliable technique for making a motion look a little bit more dressed up. It looks both more smooth and more natural than before, but there's still one problem. The eyes are jumping around. Where this problem lies is that making a tween end with a different symbol than it started with causes all the normal frames in between to just inherit the first one, even when it's moving slow at the end. So these eyes are suddenly changing or popping at the point in time where they're moving the slowest, or it's the most noticeable. What we want to do is hide this change when it's moving the fastest, and this is a technique that people who use Adobe Animate or Flash have been doing for years, and this is the secret trick that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to find the part of this tween where it moves the fastest, and what we could tell from the tweening graph is that the exact middle point is the part where the derivative is the highest, to use a word from calculus. That's why we'll find the middle point and make a keyframe that's one frame after. So if this is the middle, we're going to put a keyframe here. Making sure the properties panel is switched to object, we'll use swap symbol and change this eye to what it's supposed to be at the end, which is the surprised eye. We'll do the same thing with the other eye, so create keyframe and swap with a surprised eye. Now as we scrub through the timeline, we can see that this moment of maximum speed has one type of eye before it and one after it. So that's why we swap the eyes one frame after. The movement that's leading in has the same issue where it's popping from open to closed. We're going to do the exact same thing here. So we'll make a keyframe one frame after the middle point, or wherever your eye judges it's the fastest, and swap those open eyes to closed. Now look at that. That is clean. It's great that the popping is gone, but the problem now is that we've chopped up the tweens. So if we try to adjust one of these tweens later on, well then the tween is not going to save us now. It's not going to recalculate because we've baked this keyframe in here. These in-between keyframes are now extra details that we have to update manually, so let's fix that. Right now the blinking and the moving are kind of baked together, but what we want to do is separate them so we don't have to worry about messing up one while we're changing the other. We're going to select the symbols that make up the face, copy, and then delete those layers. Then we're going to double click to go inside the body container that we've previously set up. We're going to make a new layer and paste. Let's just put this in the place where it should be. And just for good measure, we're going to make 2 new layers, one for each of these symbols. Now if we double click to exit the body container, we can see that our face is automatically just part of the body. Because we've put them inside body container, everything that's inside the symbol moves together as one drawing. But we want this drawing to change over time. So let's double click back into our body container. Select, let's say, frame 50 across all of these layers, right click, and insert frame. Or, if you're cool, F5. Let's exit back to the main timeline and find the parts where the eyes should change. So frame 9 is where they should close, and then they'll open on frame 19. Alright, going back into our body container, let's make them close on frame 9, we're going to add a keyframe for each of these eyes, and then do the same thing on frame 19. And if your animation has different timing, those numbers are going to be different. So we'll move the playhead to somewhere after this keyframe, and we'll change the eyes by using a swap symbol. And then the same thing to make these eyes the surprised eyes. So, according to this timeline, the frames are going to close on frame 9 and then open on frame 19. So let's exit back out and watch our animation. That is not correct. Let's fix that. Now, the reason this is happening is because when we were originally animating our body container graphic, it was just 1 frame long. So every time we hit a keyframe, it's resetting to frame 1. We want our body container to advance through time in sync with the main timeline. And the simplest way to do that is to go through every keyframe and make sure that the graphic's starting frame is the same as the frame that that keyframe is at. So since this keyframe is at frame 5, the graphic is going to play its own frame 5. And the same thing here. So this keyframe is on frame 12. So we want our body container's start frame to also be frame 12. There we go, we fixed it. But it was only easy because there weren't really that many keyframes. If there's a lot of keyframes and you don't want to do that with every single one of them, or if your graphic isn't starting at frame 1, and so now your graphics into your frame is 1 while the main timeline is at frame 10. Pro tip, if you don't want to do the math to figure out what frame the graphic should be playing based on where it is in the main timeline, you can add a tween to every single keyframe, even the ones that don't need it, and then hit sync symbols. And then you can remove the tweens afterward. What this is going to do is if a tween has a tween before it, it's going to make the graphic inside of it continue where the graphic of the previous tween left off. And that is a useful feature of tweens that you might not know. So now we have an animated graphic inside our main animation, and that's playing as it should throughout our whole timeline. And if we want, we can make this guy nod up and down, all without messing up our arm raising motion. Beautiful. Like you. There's one more thing that's a little off about this animation. I mean, I'd say it looks pretty good, but one weird thing about it is how all of the body parts slow down and speed up at exactly the same time. You can see there are some frames where the whole body is motionless. I mean, it works, but it's a little dry. The next trick you can add to your tool belt is staggering. When you have an object or a character that's moving, you can have parts of it move a little before or a little after the rest of it, as a way of telling the audience this is attached, but kind of flopping around. Once again, the more hints you can give the audience about the construction of an object, the closer to realism you can get. Let's apply that to the arms here. As a rule of thumb for now, things that are attached to something are going to move a little bit later than the thing they're attached to. So let's select this whole span of frames and drag that selection to the right by 2 frames. And already you can see how it's a little bit more alive, with the motion of the arms sort of filling in the part where the rest of the body is stationary. The problem is now they're sliding around on the body, sort of breaking the illusion that this is a real shoulder. So let's do the same thing we did with the face. We're going to go to the start, select the 2 arms, copy, and delete these layers. Then we're going to double click down into our body container, make a new layer, and paste. We're going to drag these guys into place and then deselect them. Then we'll select the right arm, use Command X or Control X to cut, make a new layer to go in the back, and then use Command Shift V or Control Shift V to paste it in the same place behind everything. Now that we have our arms in place on each layer, we're going to replicate the timing of our outside motion by double-clicking back out onto our main timeline, moving our playhead to each frame, then going back inside, and then making keyframes at those same frames. So here we are at a keyframe on frame 12. We'll make a keyframe at the same point in time. So all we've done is recreate the keyframes from the main timeline just now inside our body container. Now to recreate the same arm motions from earlier. This first keyframe is the beginning of our motion, so it stays the same. And then there's our lead in. And then our big motion upward, and then the recoil. And then we just add the same twins as before. So we'll select just the span of keyframes, hit Create Classic Tween, and then choose the same ease in out cubic as before. Boom! Now it looks exactly the same as before. But now, if we go inside, select these frames, and then delay them by a couple frames, we now have the same delayed motion. Now the arms both stay connected and are staggered from the main body. And if we really want to go wild, we could extend these last tweens and change up the ease. We can manipulate them however we want. And then we can use the easing editor to change up the ease. And that's an example of staggering. Seriously, congratulations on making this first object animation. Though, I will say the combination of motions we just made goes a little overboard. It's not always going to be appropriate to add an anticipation and an overshoot. In fact, if you start doing this for every motion a character makes, it's going to get repetitive. In fact, my brother Carrie realized this, and he came to a different conclusion. If this recoiling motion is so repetitive, well, repeating is exactly what computers are good at. So he wrote a plugin for Adobe Animate called recoil.jsfl, which lets us use the power of computers to compute how to recoil. And this extension has been so useful that so many years later, compared to all the other plugins both of us have written over the years, recoil is still a tool we consider useful. So if the art of moving from one pose to another is so automatable, why don't we do it like that all the time? That would save so much time and energy, and why are we giving this plugin out for free? Oh yeah, you can download it from the same page that the assets are at. The answer is how something moves is important. If you're animating a character who's saying something, it's more important that the way you animate it conveys the mood and the tone that the scene requires. And a lot of the time, movements that are flashy or overly smooth can take away from your scene just by being distracting, not add to it. So, if you've got a story you want to tell, choose carefully. Maybe that flashy motion is what you need, and if the rest of the scene is low-key in comparison, then once it does come, well, it'll be more impressive and emphasize that moment in the scene. And with that, I want to say thank you for completing this first chapter. Once you're ready to move on to our next subject, which is making mouths move while avoiding common mistakes, I'll see you in Chapter 2. We're not here to model the mechanics of the mouth. We're here to make flapping mouth movements that look satisfying. Okay, here we are once again in the BFDI assets. If we open up the library, we can see that there are a lot of mouths in the body parts folder. Now, it seems like there's a lot of mouths, but you can pretty easily divide them into categories, where each category has a main mouth that's the most extreme version, and then there are transitional mouths that are just there to smooth out the motion. That's why for this chapter, I've narrowed down the mouths and sorted them into just the ones that are useful for lip syncing, and I've uploaded that to the same page that the BFDI assets are at, which is now up to date, so make sure to check that out again if you haven't already. Just like the previous chapter, we'll knock out a simple animation and then refine it from there. First, you're going to want to make sure you have the frame picker by opening Window, Frame Picker. And if you select any graphic that's on the stage, you can see it'll show all of the frames that are inside that graphic. Now, everyone has their own workflow, but just to make things easy to follow, we'll keep Create Keyframe unchecked so that when we click on one of these, it won't create a keyframe. Instead, it'll just change the instance that's already there. We're going to start by dragging our mouse somewhere in this area by holding down our mouse button and moving the cursor. First, I'm just going to use the frame picker to change this back to a teeth mouth. Now, to match the onset of this hey, we'll make a keyframe and open the mouth here to the widest mouth. Then, to mark the end of this syllable, we'll make another keyframe to change this mouth to the teeth version. And that's to mark the end of the syllable visually. Now that's not what happens in a real mouth, but we're doing what an animator would do to interpret this sound and stylize it in an understandable way. Now for the w sound in whir, we'll put an O mouth there. But the weird thing about this word is that in whir is also usually going to use the O mouth too. But to make it look better, let's make that the open mouth instead. And then we'll go ahead with the rest of the syllables and just mark the start and end of those syllables with an open mouth and a teeth mouth.
The Alliance. the alliance.
Now, your mouth in real life does not move a lot when you say the a lot, but we're going to put those mouth movements in there just to translate that sound in a visual way.
The alliance.
Now, our mouth is already the teeth mouth here, since it's saying iron. It's already closed here, but we want to convey the s sound somehow. If we leave it unchanged, it looks like it's pausing, so we'll actually have it open up.
Right.
Now for the word right, we're just going to put the rest of the mouth movements that we need to. So first, an O mouth. And then an open mouth.
The alliance, right? The alliance, right? Hey, we're like the alliance, right?
Great. Now I'm just going to go ahead and do that for the following line.
It's good, but it would be easier if you helped. It's good, but it would be easier if you helped. It's good, but it would be easier if you helped.
You can see how in that last syllable there, helped, your mouth actually is not moving at all when you're saying that, but I'm putting that movement there just to visually represent that part.
Hey, we're like the alliance, right?
It's good, but it would be easier if you helped.
There we go, 2 sentences that are now fully lip-synced. So now we've blocked out the main movements of the mouth. We could totally stop here, but what we want to do next is smooth it out with in-between mouths, and it's not as straightforward as it might seem. So with this pre-made mouth graphic, I've ordered these mouths so we can make keyframes to sort of walk down the row and grow the mouth over time.
Hey,
But one weird quirk about the BFDI assets is how the smallest open mouth is the same size as the teeth mouth. And what that means is that you'll end up with the mouth shape staying the same while the color inside of it changes, and you generally don't want to transition like that. Just like how in the previous chapter we used body motion to hide the eye changes, we want to use a change in size to hide the change in mouth type. So instead we'll jump from the teeth to the second open mouth. And I'll just do that by removing these keyframes here. I could do this by right-clicking and going to Clear Keyframe. But to be cool, what I'll do instead is hit Shift F6. Some of these syllables are really short, so if we want to fit all of our in-between keyframes in there, we can actually fudge the timing a bit. And I think we should, since our mouth spends a lot of time as the teeth mouth, where it's totally motionless. We have the ability to break up those pauses by moving some of the motion ahead of the audio. Pro tip, having the visuals come before the audio by a few frames is totally okay, but coming after the audio isn't. It's like our brain sees the image and uses it to predict the sound, but if the sound comes first, it's like we get caught off guard and it looks sloppy.
hey, we're like the alliance, right? Hey, we're like the alliance, right?
Now, that might just look like a blur, but all I've done is just stuff in between mouths, in between where the main mouths were. And then I've also shifted some a bit just to make room where there weren't enough frames just to put them. Now to do it with the other line.
It's good, but it would be easier if you helped. It's good, but it would be easier if you helped. It's good, but it would be easier if you helped.
Now we've smoothed out all the mouth motions. Thankfully, pencil in this line isn't speaking all that quickly, so we have room to fit in the mouth opening and the mouth closing. But if these syllables were faster, you'd only keep the mouth closing, which you'll see in the next section.
Hey, we're like the alliance, right?
It's good, but it would be easier if you helped.
Let's open a scene that I animated in BFB 14, which has a good amount of lip syncing with custom mouths, and you can also find this FLA online, once again at bfdi.tv/assets. Here we are, looking at 13-60.fla. Now, as a rule of thumb, the closed mouth should be at about the same height as the top lip of the open mouth, so the bottom lip is what's doing most of the moving. That's just mirroring the way that a mouth moves in real life, when it's your jaw going up and down. In addition, we usually want the closed mouth to be wider than the open mouth. It's as if the open mouth has been squashed and flattened out. For adding in-between mouths, I find it helps to make them very highly eased, so the open mouth will have an in-between version that's 90% like the original open mouth, but then 10% going into the closed mouth. There's no reason it has to be eased like that. Like, you can make it 50-50, where it's halfway between open and closed, but most of the time I find it looks better to keep the animation looking snappy. For the closed mouth, we could choose to make it ease out so it slowly completes its motion, but when the mouth is moving fast, I prefer to have it already be on its way back open. So you'll often get this pattern where each mouth movement is 2 frames long, and it starts with the more extreme version before bouncing back in a sort of ease in motion. And I find that looks better than those 2 frames being an ease out, where it's completing a motion. But if a syllable is longer than that, then an ease out is perfectly fine. Here are 2 things you can do whether you draw your own mouths or you're using existing mouth assets. These are going to add extra life and character either way. The first thing is to add some horizontal motion. Just like how we made the arm raising motion more organic by adding some complexity, we're going to make this mouth motion look a bit less one-directional by skewing it one way as the mouth opens and the other way as it closes. This is going to give it a circular motion, so instead of the mouth changing directions completely, now it's going to look at least a little bit more continuous. We're going to hop back into our existing animation and carefully go through each keyframe so that as the mouth opens, it's skewed in one direction. And as it closes, it'll be skewed in the other.
Hey, we're like the Alliance, right? Hey, we're like the Alliance, right?
Depending on how well you do it, it could give you some good results. Now, with that extra variation added, you can see how it takes it a bit further from just swapping assets and closer to a more organic movement. Well, let's just see if I can do that a little bit better with the second one.
It's good, but it'll be easier if you helped. It's good, but it'll be easier if you helped.
The second thing we'll do is add some transitions to the O mouths, which are pretty different from the rest of the mouths, so they stand out, and what we want to do is blend them a bit better. Let's find the O mouths. There's one, and then we'll manually squash the mouth that's right before it. I'm holding Alt so that the right side stays in place. We could add other adjustments like skewing or rotating it, but as long as the general shape is closer to the O mouth, we'll get a smoother transition. And then we'll do the same thing for the mouth directly after it.
Hey, we're like the Alliance, right?
It's good, but it'll be easier if you helped.
We have now made our mouth movements a little bit more fancy. Can I rant a bit? If you look up guides about lip syncing, chances are you'll be shown something that looks like this. It's a chart assigning mouth shapes to different letters. I know it's a good starting point for learning, but I just want to rant about why so many of the learning materials about lip syncing are either misinformed or straight up lie to you. Don't use L mouths. La, na, da, ta, sa. All of these consonants use the tip of the tongue, not just the letter L. If you're going to use an L mouth, you should be using it for all of these consonants because they're what are called alveolar consonants. They are all produced by touching the tip of your tongue to the alveolar ridge behind the teeth. None of these consonants even involve the teeth in any way. What's more messed up about this L mouth is that in English, the L phoneme is the only alveolar consonant that doesn't even use the tip of the tongue much of the time. If you speak one of these dialects of English, chances are that if you say an L at the end of a syllable, it becomes a dark L. I'm doing it right now. Say L. That consonant, the dark L, is a velar consonant, so it's made in the throat. You can't draw that, unless you're drawing a medical diagram. Anyway, I'm done ranting. All I'm trying to say is that there are no hard rules you can follow that translate written letters into mouth shapes. It's all about making something that just feels right. We're not here to model the mechanics of the mouth. We're here to make flapping mouth movements that look satisfying. Just like how the arm raising motion we made last chapter was stylized, moving mouths should be stylized too. It should feel right more than it should match the waveform on your timeline. This is a real face. This is not a real face. It's being animated with lines that are being drawn on a screen. And still, you can imagine that it's a 3D object. I can face this way, or that way. How? I'm not real. I'm 2D right now. But what is it that lets me look 3D? An object show face is one of the simplest faces you can draw, let's be honest, but how do you keep it looking more like a face compared to just a jumble of circles and lines? In this chapter, we'll look at 2 techniques we use all the time in BFB. They're only useful when you know when to use them and when not to use them, but if you do it right, it'll go a long way to make these faces look like they belong to real characters. 3 levels of blinking. We're going to make our character blink at 3 different levels of detail. Now with Adobe Animate open, we've got our character with each asset on a different layer, and we've got the 3 assets that make up the face all on the topmost layers. Level 1, keyframes without motion. The fastest way to do this is to select one frame on both layers of the 2 eyes, and then use F6 to convert it to a keyframe, and then select a frame about 4 frames later and convert that to a keyframe. Now that we've got 2 keyframes, we can go back to the earlier keyframe and swap both eyes with the closed ones. And now what we can see is if we move our playhead forward, we actually don't need to reset our eyes back open because we've stored that in the keyframe that we've made. And if we play what we've got here, we can see that it's something that's recognizable as a blink. But before we move on to level 2, I want to give you another rule of thumb, which is that the line of your closed eye should be at about the same height or below the bottom edge of your open eye. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to find this button, Onion Skin. If we click on it, these 2 lines appear to the left and to the right of our playhead, and all the frames that are between those lines show up as guides. If I move my playhead to the left, you can see how the previous keyframe is suddenly visible in blue. And if I extend this range, you can see that the next keyframe, our open eye, also appears in green too. So using these open eyes as a guide, I can actually move this down, so it's like our character's eyelids are dropping down to meet the bottom of the eyes, and maybe even pushing them a bit further. It's like how a mouth closes with the jaw coming upward. You could definitely make both edges come together in the middle, but giving it a more general direction just makes it easier to understand. And we can do that because we can see what our eye looks like in the other frame. They're like ghosts from the past and future, haunting us today. We can't touch them or edit them, but they're there to guide us. So our eyes are following the general motion of going downward when they close. On to level 2. Keyframes with anticipation and recoil. The next super quick thing we can do on top of this is to add another keyframe 2 frames before, and then use the arrow keys to nudge them down a little bit further. Let's enable our onion skin again just to see what we're doing. You can see how our eyes are revealing a little bit of blue, and that's just the position of the eyes where they were previously. Then we'll go to where the eyes are closed, and we'll put a keyframe, and we'll go back to the frame where they're first closing. We'll select those frames, and then use the arrow keys to push them down a little bit further. And I should just keep onion skin enabled. This is something you can do pretty easily by pressing Alt-Shift-O. After that, we'll find the keyframe where the eyes open back up again, and put a keyframe 2 frames after that. If we go back to the original open eyes keyframes, which is this one right here, and if we nudge the eyes upward a bit, our newer keyframe still stores the original position. Now if we play our animation, we can see we've added both a lead-in and a recoil to our blinking animation. Even though it's kind of choppy, we can see how we've added a lot more life and character to our blinking animation, even while we're animating on 2s. Which is what it's called when we move on every other frame. The last level is level 3, tweens with recoil. We'll start by turning these in-between keyframes into endpoints for our tween. So drag this first keyframe so that it's touching the following keyframe. Then we'll add a new keyframe about 5 or 6 frames before the first one. That'll be the beginning of our first tween. Then you'll remember that we have 2 keyframes of our closed eyes. We'll find the keyframe where they open up and drag it backwards so that it's touching the eye closed keyframe that's right before it. Now we've made 3 different spaces for 3 different tweens. For the first one, let's create a classic tween and make it cubic ease in. Then another classic tween, and this one is also cubic ease in. And finally, a third classic tween that's cubic ease out. Let's extend this one a little bit. And with that, we've completed the fanciest level of a blink. You can always tweak the timing or change the scale or position of the in-between eyes however you want, but with those 3 levels, you now have 3 different ways to set up a blink, all depending on how much time you want to spend or your animation style. Drawing an object show face is pretty straightforward, so I won't be covering that. But moving from one expression to another isn't. There's so many ways the character's face can move when it's changing expression, even given the same start and end point. This first technique is just one way to do it. It's more of a template you can follow that'll help your character's face look more alive as it's moving from one expression to another. This file I've opened is the first scene in BFB 13, and it's by Niall Burns, also known as Zany Leaves. I love the scene because Niall's pretty much demonstrating his mastery of object show face animations. There's so many great parts of it to study that I highly recommend you download it for yourself and take a look. One thing you'll see pretty often though is how often characters blink, and part of the reason is when you need to move from one facial expression to another, it helps for that transition to be compounded with another motion.
What? Please hang out out with me! If you couldn't tell, I'm busy. Come on, you're basically the only person I want to talk to anymore. And it's been so long. Yeah, but aren't you like friends with Lollipop or something now? I share a mutual friend with her, thank you, and I don't even like that friend at the moment. But could you not talk about my team right now? Well, sorry, but I feel like I have to. You need to start caring what they think of you. You're a team. That's not helping. I can't hear you. Someday you'll thank me. Sorry about that, Spongy. How about we play some table tennis?
I'd rather play ping pong.
Just like the staggering technique from Chapter 1, we're adding an additional emotion to both fill things out and also hide any pops or jerks that the differences between the before and after faces might give us. Eye blinking is just one of those natural motions you're likely to see anyway, and any character can blink at any time, so it's only natural that it's such a widely used technique. In the next section, we'll learn a little bit more about how a good blink is made. So we've made a blink with just plain eyes, but if we want to transition between expressions, we're going to need to transition eyebrows too, and they're going to be different from one expression to the next. The weird thing is, when you blink in real life, your eyebrows usually aren't moving too, but for our animation, to make it look more interesting, the forehead is going to move as one object, sort of like the skin is stretching, just depending on how you do it. So I've gone ahead and added some eyebrows to our character, and you can draw some of your own if you want to follow along. So the first expression is going to have eyebrows that look like this, while the second is going to have eyebrows that look like this. The first thing though is that I noticed our eyes are bouncing back as part of the recoil at the end. Let's hop into that second to last keyframe and use onion skin. So with onion skin enabled, we'll drag these eyes down so that they're now rising into place. Anyway, back to our eyebrows. I'm going to select these eyebrows here and convert those two eyebrows into one symbol using F8. And the same with the second pair of eyebrows. We could definitely animate them separately, but just to save us some time, it usually works to just consider them as one drawing. Now we'll make our first keyframe at the same point in time as the first keyframe of the eyes, and the same with the second keyframe. We want our eyebrows to follow the motion of the eyes, so we're going to bring them down. And why not squash them and sort of stretch them horizontally? It's like they're being compressed. Then we'll bring our keyframe for the new drawing right up against our second keyframe. This marks the point where one symbol switches to another, and we're using the downward motion to hide that switch. Now let's put a keyframe matching the timing of our final keyframe in the eyes. And we'll go back to adjust this original keyframe. If we turn on onion skin, we can then transform these eyebrows, and we'll try to match the way that our earlier drawing was moving. Now the outer edges are the parts that we notice the most, so we'll try to make it so that they match more than any other part of the eyebrows. So what we've done is we've tried to continue the motion of the original eyebrows, just with our newer drawing instead. Now the hard part is over, and we can add our tweens. We'll add the same cubic ease into our first span of frames. But then we can consider the second span to be one motion with one tween, and we'll give it a cubic ease in out, sort of to match the way the eyes are doing a cubic ease in and then a cubic ease out. But instead this tween is just going to be one tween that is just one ease, cubic ease in out. And just like that, we've given eyebrows to our character that look like they're moving with the eyes. The other technique we're looking at is masking. This is when you've got a character looking to the side and half of their face is showing, but you want the other half to be cut off the edge. Now, because it's a bit more complicated, there's a few tips I want to show you for working with faces that have masks. So if we dive back into our BFDI assets, what we can see is that every BFDI character body has both a normal version and a mask version. This mask version is a copy of the normal version, but it's flattened into just one shape, so it works better with Adobe Animate's masking. What's going on here is we've got Teardrop's normal body asset, and on the layers above it, this is the face, and it's masked to the Teardrop mask asset. So there's two different symbols which could get misaligned at any time, and we can only hope that they stay in the same place and that they stay aligned. That's why what I recommend is keeping your body, your face, and that mask all inside of another graphic. So the container graphic can do all the moving, and you don't have to animate the body graphic itself. Within the container, the body and the mask are just going to stay still. That way you never have to worry about them getting out of sync if you just want the character's body to move. We just learned how to make our face movements look so much better, but before we finish this chapter, I just want to end with an example from BFDI. But this example is unique because it's animated in a totally different way from any other episode. Unlike any BFDI video that came before it, it was animated not in Adobe Animate, but using code. And part of the reason it still feels like BFDI is because the code we wrote still follows the same rules of animating that we do when we're animating normally. One way you can see this is how the bodies are rotating around their bottom edge, where the legs are attached, to give the illusion that that's where the center of mass is. But a more interesting part, which you can apply to your own animations, is how the face moves across the body. You can even see how even though the body rotates, the face isn't doing any rotation itself. No matter which way the body turns, the rotation of the face is just based off the body. From the body's perspective, the face is just straight and upright. The reason for this is something we can see when we consider our characters' faces to be 3D objects. I've used screenshots of our show as examples by adding an actual 3D cube in front of it. More often than not, the body defines where the flat 3D plane is, and the face just sits on the surface of it. There aren't any 3D models used in BFDI, but when we draw these characters in these weird angles, it helps to pretend that they are in 3D and that we're looking through a real camera. Our object show faces are usually made of horizontal and vertical lines, so for example, the vertically shaped eyes are usually going to be parallel to the vertical edges of the body, or the horizontal mouth is going to be parallel to the horizontal edges of the body. The result is that most faces aren't going to be rotated compared to the body. If you've got a super exaggerated expression though, you're free to go wild with crooked eyes and mouths, but the general rule is that the straight lines of the face are going to follow the same perspective as the body that it's attached to. And that's the end of chapter 3. We're now halfway through the whole graphy. I'm so glad you've made it this far. When you're ready to tackle more advanced body movements, I'll see you in chapter 4. Here's an animation I made earlier that looks something like this. What we're going to do is we are going to replicate this motion here. It's based off of this sketch. The first thing we'll do is put the body, face, and the legs in one symbol by using cut frames. And then insert new symbol. We're going to call this symbol body container. And let's make sure that type is set to graphic. Now we just paste frames and make sure we have more than enough frames by selecting some frame in the distant future. Let's say frame 120 and then press F5 to insert a frame. Let's go back to our main timeline and clean up this timeline. I'm going to add another layer and then we'll delete the rest of the layers. Let's drag our body container onto the stage and then extend it to include as many frames as we need. Once again, let's do frame 120. I'm going to select this frame and press F5. One last thing, I'm going to double click back into our body container and hide the legs for now by selecting these two layers, right clicking and selecting guide. What that does is once we're outside of this symbol, those legs no longer show up. They're only visible when we're editing body container. Now let's put this in another symbol by hitting F8 and we'll call this body container 2. Make sure that type is graphic and then we'll hit OK. One last time, we'll go into body container 2 and make sure that we have enough frames inside of it by selecting frame 120 and hitting F5. Time to finally exit back to our main timeline and add some motion. Right now we have one keyframe on frame 1. Let's lift our body container 2 into the air. Then we'll tween it downward by inserting a keyframe at frame 13 and moving this symbol downward by holding shift and dragging. I'm gonna tweak this first keyframe by moving it back inside the stage like that. I just decided I don't really want him to fall from that high. So that's our two keyframes. I'm going to right click somewhere between these two keyframes, hit create classic tween, go to the properties panel and change the ease to ease in quart. This is a quartic ease in. That's our falling motion. Then we'll add another keyframe at frame 30 and bring our body container 2 upward a bit. That's our guy springing back after landing. We'll add a classic tween and open up the easing editor to make this somewhat of an ease in out, where it's faster at the beginning compared to the end. Now, making sure we have the selection tool activated, we'll double click to go inside our body container 2, and we'll put some keyframes at the same points in time as the main timeline. So frame 13, and then frame 30. Let's rotate frame 1 so it's leaning forward a bit, and then frame 13 so it's leaning backward. Now if we select a span of frames like this, right click and create classic tween. We'll leave the first tween how it is as a linear ease, but we'll give the second tween an ease out back. If we open up the easing editor, we can see how it's a type of ease out that starts fast but then overshoots past 100% before finally returning to the final value. Now if we double click back out to the main timeline and play what we have, we can now see that nice complexity that our nested graphics allow us. And if there's ever any popping that happens, just make sure that the transform point of your graphic is the same on all frames by double clicking it on each keyframe, and that your graphic is playing all its frames in sync with the outer timeline. So a keyframe on frame 1 will say frame 1, and a keyframe on frame 13 will have a graphic that's also playing frame 13. Okay, so we have our landing motion, time to add the jump. So far, our main timeline has been where all the vertical motion's been happening. Let's keep it that way. Just like the sketch from earlier, we'll make our guy go up a bit by putting a keyframe on frame 45 and shifting our body container 2 up slightly. We'll create a classic tween and use the ease editor to give it an ease out that's slower at the start, so something that looks like this. Now it's time for our big anticipation. We'll put a keyframe at frame 55 and move our body container 2 downward a lot. We'll give this classic tween an ease that's once again an ease in out, but slow at the end. And I can choose from our custom tweens to reuse an easing that we made beforehand. So in this case, my ease 1. This ease is once again slow at the end. So this guy's really preparing for his big jump. That's the feeling we want to give. And then comes the top of the jump. Let's put a keyframe at frame 75 with our guy way up in the air and give this classic tween an ease in out that's slow at the end. And I can once again reselect that custom ease. Because this ease in out is slow at the end, it's like he's really hanging in the air. Finally, our last keyframe on frame 90 brings him off the bottom edge of the screen. We'll give this tween a more familiar cubic ease in. That was a lot, but now look at what we've made. That's a hefty guy right there. Well done. Now we can spice up our motion and really give this guy a sense that he's pushing himself by adding more rotation inside body container 2. This time, our keyframes are not going to be in sync with the main timeline, so even though frame 45 is where our vertical movement is motionless, we're going to dive in and put a keyframe at frame 50 instead. We'll make our body container lean backward and give it a classic tween. And we'll choose from our existing custom tweens to get the ease in out that's slow at the start. Now we'll make a keyframe at frame 60 and lean our body container forward for that authentic pushing feeling. And this classic tween will have a good old quart ease in out. Finally, we'll put one last keyframe at frame 90 and lean this symbol backward. This tween is going to have no ease at all, and you'll see why, because we are done with this motion. Let's double click back to the main timeline and take a look at what we've made. You can see how the difference in timing and easing lets us fill in this slow part at frame 55. And the top of our peak, where Blocky is just hanging in the air, really emphasizes that final slow rotation we made. Picture yourself jumping across a chasm. Don't you want to throw your arms backward to give yourself that extra boost? Let's take Blocky out of his T-pose and give the arms some motion. I feel like this is such a good example of how nesting helps us, because we didn't have to do anything to keep the arms staying attached. And now we're free to rotate the arms however we want, with whatever timing we want. With the selection tool active, let's dive back inside body container, where everything has just been motionless so far. At the beginning, that's where Blocky's starting to fall, so we'll start with our arms pointing down. Then we'll keyframe the arms at frame 13. And why not click this button to lock all of the layers and then unlock the two arms. On this keyframe on frame 13, the arms are going to be pointing mostly up. Then we'll just hit Command A or Control A to select the two arms, since everything else is locked. We'll add a classic tween, but not give it an ease. This is the arms gradually rising as Blocky falls. Now we'll put a keyframe on frame 40 for these two arms, and we'll move them back down. This tween is going to have an ease out elastic. If we look at the graph, we can see how this ease is extremely useful, especially when you're layering it with some other motions, and I like to think of it as a fancier version of the back ease. Let's double click back out to the main timeline and see what those arms look like in context. In this case, we're making the arms suddenly flop down as Blocky hits the ground. You'll notice that the easing makes the speed of the arms discontinuous here. That's breaking the rule of smooth motion from chapter 1. But since it's a reaction to a collision happening, and since there's other movements going on at the same time, it's totally fine. Time to finish the rest of the arm motion. Let's find a keyframe where Blocky is unrotated and dive back inside body container. Then we'll keyframe the arms on frame 48. We're going to move these arms so they both point forward. It's like Blocky saying, hold up. We're going to give this tween the custom tween that's slow at the end. But these arms, depending on how you rotate them, might not be in the right direction. For example, if I rotate them a little bit further, you'll see that one of the arms goes in the opposite direction. And so to make sure that they're all going in the right direction, we'll select the tween and specify the rotation as counterclockwise. We're going to change this 1 to a 0 to specify that this means 0 full rotations. And we'll do the same thing with the other arm. Rotation is going to be counterclockwise, 0 full rotations. And that is going to ensure that the arms are rotating in the correct direction. Now for the throwing motion, where Blocky's thrusting his arms backward. We'll put a keyframe at frame 60, and we're going to rotate these arms backward. This arm, I'm going to move a bit so that it's still showing. I'm going to move the playhead backward, make sure these frames are selected, and give it a classic tween, with an ease in out that's slow at the end. And specify the rotation as clockwise, 0 full revolutions. That's going to give a motion like this. Finally, the arms are going to make one last rotation as Blocky hangs in the air and relaxes his arms. We'll put a keyframe at frame 65 and swap each of the straight arms with a bent arm. We're going to flip this arm by going to Modify, Transform, Flip Horizontal. And that's to ensure that they're both drooping down like this. And I'm going to rotate the arms so they're a little bit higher. Now, if we try to tween them, you'll see how the transition isn't the smoothest. So like we learned before, we'll be careful to hide the switch from straight to bent during a fast motion. So I've undone that tween, and we'll put a keyframe at frame 85. Then we'll go back to the second to last keyframe, enable onion skin, and use that preview to approximate the halfway point between the first and second positions. And the same thing with this arm, we're going to try to approximate the halfway point. Then we'll press Command A or Control A to select these frames, give it a classic tween, and change the ease to an elastic ease out. Finally, we'll make the straight arms start to move by placing a keyframe right before the bent arms, and using our onion skin preview to bring the straight arms right up against the incoming bent arms. And then we'll give the preceding keyframe a tween that is cubic ease in. We are done with the arms. Let's double click back to the main timeline and admire what we've made. Look at that. All of this staggered motion really gives Blocky a feeling of weight. Now all he needs are some legs. Let's bring back the legs by choosing the selection tool and then diving back inside so we're editing body container. We'll select the leg layers and then uncheck the guide option. Now if we go back to the main timeline, we might notice something. First off, it doesn't really look right how the feet are sliding on the ground. We want the legs to move with Blocky while he's in the air, but stay attached to the floor when he's grounded. Somehow, we have to switch which graphic the legs belong to first when he makes contact with the floor, and then a second time when he breaks contact with it. Here's how. Right now we're in the main timeline. Let's make 2 new layers and bring them below our body container 2. We'll add a keyframe to these 2 layers, and then we'll select body container 2 and go to modify, break apart. Though I recommend Command B or Control B. We'll repeat this until the leg symbols actually show up, but no further. We'll make sure these 2 legs are selected, copy, and then undo how we broke it apart. Finally, use Command Shift V to paste these legs in place on the lower layer. If I lock this layer and hide it, you can see that these legs are now in our main timeline. I'm gonna cut this leg and use Command Shift V to paste it in place. So now these 2 legs are 1 on each layer. What we've done is we've grabbed the legs through all those layers of nesting and brought them onto the main timeline while still preserving their transformation. Now we can dive back inside body container, select frame 13 on the frames with the legs, and convert it to a keyframe. Then we'll do the same thing on frame 60, which is when Blocky leaves the ground. And then while making sure that these layers are unlocked, select these frames and remove their contents. We've made the legs disappear from body container and then reappear. If we go back to the main timeline to look at what we've done, we can see how we sort of transfer the legs from the innermost graphic to our main timeline. And then let's go to frame 60 and use the F7 key to place an empty keyframe for when the legs reappear inside body container. I'm going to go back to frame 13 and rotate these legs so it looks more like they're standing on the ground. And I'm going to move them backward a little bit. One issue right now is that if we try to tween these legs, or skew them through a tween, you can see the feet are still prone to sliding on the floor. I'm going to undo those keyframes because what we need to do instead is first move the transform point to the feet. I don't think it really matters where on the feet, but as long as we can make sure that transformations occur around the feet, that'll maintain the sense of attachment to the ground, which in this section is a lot more important than the attachment to the body. At this point, we're free to add whatever keyframing or tweening we decide looks right, just to try to match the motion of the body. It's literally impossible to match the motion exactly, since that motion was created with nesting that we can't replicate here. But as long as it's somewhat close, it should still work. And now that the nesting of the legs is all sorted out, we can dive back inside body container and tweak the mid-air legs to look more natural by swapping the straight legs for leg bent above. I've made the legs at the beginning move with a linear ease just to give the sense that they're floating freely. It's not super important that they transition perfectly to the standing legs, since there's such a big impact happening at that same time. But if it makes it easier, you can use onion skin to help you by enabling it while you're on the main timeline, and then diving back inside. Now, even if you disable it while you're inside, you'll still see that preview, and you can use that to help you judge where the legs should end up. And the same goes for when the dangling legs reappear. It's not super important that they transition seamlessly, but in this case, I've given them an elastic tween, since it layers pretty nicely with the rest of the motions that are happening at the same time. Lastly, you can unlock the rest of the layers in body container and add some eye motions. Now, there's so many motions going on at once that, in my opinion, you won't even need to smooth out these eye motions at all. And that's an advanced body movement. Hopefully this helps you use nesting and staggering in your own animations. I've now opened up a scene from BFB 16 that I personally worked on, and I think that it's got a body movement that has a bit of complexity to it.
Oh my snowstorm! Floor's actually struggling to do something! This I gotta see!
Spongie's the largest contestant to be eliminated by 7 times!
Good to know.
Now this part is just going to be me freely talking about what I'm observing here.
Wow!
In this case, this motion that Loser is making is kind of a combination of a lot of techniques. You can even see here on the main timeline, I've sort of left this symbol here with quite a bit of nesting, as his legs are are flopping around on their own. Look at how exaggerated these legs are here before they finally recoil and return back to their natural state. And that's an example of how I want to combine both the legs swinging forward with Loser flying through the air. And the part where this leg is reaching out like that, even though this frame is so exaggerated, just the fact that the general shape is more similar to the leg that comes right after it just makes it seem more continuous. And it's hard to notice at full speed that this leg has such an exaggerated transform applied to it. You can see on the timeline how I've transitioned from one symbol to another, just to help break this into small parts that are a lot easier to deal with. In this case, this symbol has just 2 layers to it, and that's because I've put everything that's not this other leg all in one symbol. And that's where all of this fancy swinging and elastic motion is happening. And then there's this third piece here, after Loser jumps into the air. And this is where the spinning happens. Once again, we're using nesting to our advantage, since the spinning happens in its own timeline. You can see that you can combine motion tweens and shape tweens freely. In this case, if I decide to hide all layers but one, you can see how one part is doing its own piece of the pie. It's its own piece of the puzzle. But this motion is made a lot easier to deal with just because we don't have to worry about the rest of Loser's body motion happening. We don't have to worry about Loser floating through the air. We're just dealing with this single motion here. So I've backed out back into the main timeline. And I've already used a combination of the spline tween and just usual motion tweens. I think this is somewhat of a sine wave kind of tween. That's the motion of Loser's body after flinging himself into the air. You can see how he sort of oscillates back and forth like that. Finally, after he finishes that spin, he's going to transition back into another symbol. Once he lands, this is a completely different symbol. And it's got its own tweens here. That in itself is made up of multiple parts. And see, we don't even have to worry about that vertical jump, because in this symbol, we're just worrying about the turn that he makes here. And of course, I've used this existing flapping arm motion to sort of fill out the slowness that's happening here, or the staticness, as his body is just staying in place. This leg is transitioning from a bent one into a straight one. I'm back on the main timeline now, and there's a shape tween over here. What is that shape tween? That is Loser's leg. Okay, that was not a very substantial shape tween. And then there's another jump, and finally, I believe this is a repeat of the same symbol as before. But you can see how we've combined a number of different symbols, both by nesting symbols, but also by switching from one to another across multiple frames. And that just helps our brain have to worry about less things at once. So anything that's happening here with these sort of extended arms, we don't have to worry about when we're editing this symbol here with the jump. These extended arms all happen within this one scope here. And then once we swap it with this symbol, we don't have to worry about these arms anymore. Now we're just dealing with the spin and the jump. And that is BFB episode 16, scene 10. That is Loser's jump as he's doing his little dance. That is all I have to say about that scene. Do you ever feel like you have this clear idea of a pose in your head, but when you go to animate it, it just doesn't come out right? Like when you're looking at the program, you feel like it's so clumsy having to drag all these little points and then position these symbols just right. I mean, I definitely feel like that all the time, which is why I'm with you in declaring that animating in symbols is hard. And that applies to full body movements more than anything. I think we've all seen a Flash animation where it's like you just look at it and you think, that looks stiff. That looked like it was made of pieces. I've definitely experienced that before, and it's like the whole point of puppet animation, which is to save time and energy. Like it's just gone out the window. And for sure, it's true you don't have to redraw every frame like you do in traditional animation, but now all this work has shown up in a different way. Now instead, there's a million assets that you have to rotate or move or otherwise tweak just to recreate the same natural feeling you would automatically get if you were just animated traditionally. So I've declared a problem, but there's got to be a solution. What if we considered the act of posing a character's assets to be the final stage of animating? With the amount of detail that you need to provide when you're posing these assets, in some ways it's got more in common with data entry than art. If you feel overwhelmed when you're just rotating an eyebrow and then you realize that there's the entire other body to bring to life, just know that you're not alone. There isn't a single landscape artist who starts off their piece by painting off every blade of grass. What we want to do is block out our motions before we go to pose the individual body parts, and how we do this is low tech. We can get the best of both worlds by drawing things on paper. If we made the asset posing the last step, well then we can leave most of the creativity to the step before it. That takes all the pressure off of us in terms of coming up with the expressions and on the character motives on the fly, when all we're trying to do is just make these shapes move in a polished way. Now, we don't have to choose between making an expressive animation and making a polished animation. It's easy to do without making this choice because I think that fiddling with all the vector shapes on the computer is a trap. If we remember what we originally came here to do, which is to make a cartoon, then drawing things out again is the obvious choice. In fact, I recommend not only planning out your movements on paper, but also just practicing how a character moves. You can see here I'm sketching out a bunch of different gestures. All of these gestures are things you could imagine a person doing in real life, just like we're practicing the way it might feel to draw it on a 2D sheet of paper. And that builds up habits that'll help us when we go to tinker with the 2D assets in Adobe Animate. To wrap this up, all I want to say is that when we don't have to worry about the anchor point of a movie clip or the easing of a tween, it frees up our brain to think, well, what does it actually feel like to push a boulder? How can I make the audience feel pain when my character gets their hand trapped in a door frame? I want you to be less stressed out by the complexity of Adobe Animate, and the freedom of drawing things on paper is how we get there. In fact, the more we practice drawing things on paper and drawing these gestures, the easier it gets to think, oh, curved line here, straight line here. Because whether we like it or not, there's a visual language we can benefit from becoming fluent in. If we want to convey where our character's center of mass is, or which arm they're putting their energy into, it really helps to practice communicating it in a drawing. Getting used to the feeling of translating real-life actions into 2D shapes on paper is going to help you at the same time to translate them into shapes on the screen. How is a walk cycle different from a run cycle? Well, how is a walk different from a run? First, let's open the standard BFDI assets file. We'll select all of the frames from frame 17 to the end across all layers. And then we'll right-click and hit Remove Frames, or press Shift F5. This is going to leave us with frames 1 through 16. That's for the 4 stages of our walk cycle, each stage showing up for 4 frames. Let's make a new layer for our leg. And I'm just going to remove the rest of these layers here, just to clean things up a bit. This layer I'm just going to rename to Leg. We'll go to our library and find Body Parts, Limbs, Legs, Leg Straight, and bring that onto the stage. I'm going to zoom in using Command plus or Control plus, and with the Transform tool activated, I'm going to double click this white circle to move the transform point to the top left corner. Now in addition to our leg, let's add a guide which will act as our ground. We'll make another layer below our leg and find the symbol in our library called Backgrounds Cloud 3. With our new layer selected, let's drag Cloud 3 onto our stage so that it ends up on the layer beneath our leg. I'm going to position it like this. Let's double click this layer's name and call it Ground Guide. And then we'll right click it and enable the guide option. So this cloud is here to simulate the ground for us. If we move this cloud linearly to the left, it'll be like simulating the ground moving past our leg. And it'll be easy to tell if our foot is sliding on the ground, since we can just see if the motion of the foot matches the motion of the ground. So we'll place a keyframe at frame 16. Let's change our zoom to 100% and move this cloud leftward by holding Shift and keeping it held while we press the left arrow key 5 times. And the reason we press Shift left arrow key 5 times is because that's the distance that we want our walk cycle to move over the course of 16 frames. We'll right-click the first keyframe and create Classic Tween. Finally, let's lock this layer. That's the speed our walking animation is going to be traveling at. Now let's plot out the actual leg motion. We're going to add keyframes to our leg layer on frames 5, 9, and 13. And this leaves us with an evenly spaced 4 frames per keyframe. So let's go back to the first keyframe and rotate the leg to the right by about 30 degrees, and it's going to actually snap to that angle as you can see here. The second keyframe is going to stay exactly how it is. And then the third keyframe is going to be rotated backward. Let's enable onion skin, and that'll help us see what it looks like compared to the other keyframes. So we're going to skew this a bit so that the tip of the foot stays on the surface of the ground. So we want it to look like it's rotated by the same amount as the previous movement. So looking at the previous keyframe here, we want to evenly space this out, so it's like the foot is moving backward at a constant rate. I'm looking at the dark space that these feet create, and it definitely looks like I want to move this leftward a bit. Alright, I'm happy with that. Finally, the fourth keyframe is going to have a bent leg. We'll make sure this leg is selected, and then go to the Properties panel and use Swap Symbol. We're going to select Leg Bent Above. We're going to use the onion skin previews to help guide us, so let's squash and skew this leg to give it a bent, curled up look. If we raise this foot high enough, we'll get the circular motion that we want. Now, we're done setting up our 4 stages. I've now disabled onion skin, and we're going to enable loop mode. I'm going to just resize this window to reveal that button. I'll drag this looping section to cover the entire timeline, and let's play it. I could remove this guide so that we're not distracted by the movement of that cloud, so we can just look at the leg movement itself. There we go, that's the gist of it. We've already got the skeleton of a walk cycle down. Very well done. Time to fill in our walk cycle with some in-betweens, bringing us from animated on 4s to animated on 2s, and that's going to help make this animation look especially smooth. I'm going to remove the loop preview and resize this window back down. Now let's put a keyframe at frame 3 and swap this leg straight with a leg straight scrunched. Now let's enable onion skin. What I want to do by using this asset is to get that scrunched look, like the heel is getting pressed on the ground as the foot hits the floor. I'm going to stretch out and skew this asset. And this is because I want to give it the right length and get the right angle for the heel that's pressed against the floor. And what's also happening is, thanks to onion skin being enabled, we're also trying to get the angle of the straight leg to be between the keyframes that come before and after it. Now for the next in-between. We'll put a keyframe at frame 7, and this one's pretty simple. We're just going to skew the straight leg, continuing the motion of pushing the ground to the left. For the next in-between, we'll put a keyframe at frame 11, but then we'll leave frame 11 how it is and go back to frame 9. See this leg here, it's the second to most recent keyframe that we can see here. This leg will also swap with leg straight scrunched. And this leg is going to have the toes pressed into the ground, while the heel is lifted. So we'll skew and squash this leg just right so that the leg's angle is between the frames before and after it. But this in-between is eased out because the angle of this leg here is a lot closer to the keyframe that comes after it. Finally, we'll put a keyframe at frame 15. In this case, we'll rotate this bent leg forward a bit, and maybe rotate the keyframe that came before it backward a bit, so that it's more similar to the straight leg that came right before it. You can see how throughout all these drawings we're trying to maintain this consistent circular shape, where the foot positions are as evenly spaced as possible. But we are done. It's like we've doubled the resolution in a way. Now our leg motion looks so much smoother than before. I think now we're ready to see what it looks like on 2 legs. Now that we're animated on 2s, I think our walking motion is smooth enough and well-defined enough to see what this looks like in context. Now, to be totally honest, one leg walking is not the most natural thing to see. Let's give our leg a sibling by moving it into a symbol so that we can reuse this. Let's select the frames of our leg and the guide layer, and right-click them. We'll hit Cut Frames, and then navigate to Insert New Symbol, or press Command F8 or Control F8. Let's give this symbol the name Walk Cycle, and make sure type is set to graphic. Hit OK. Now we'll right-click the one frame that is there, and hit Paste Frames. Now if we back out to the main timeline, we can open up our library and drag the walk cycle graphic onto the stage, and if we play our timeline, we can see the graphic playing out as normal. One trick I recommend for duplicating something as fast as possible, even faster than hitting Command C and Command V, is to hold Alt while dragging. So I've moved the playhead back to frame 1, and while holding Alt, I'm going to drag our walk cycle symbol. In fact, let's hold Shift too, to lock the dragging to just a horizontal motion, and we'll let go of the mouse. So the legs are spread apart like this. And if we play it, well, this could totally work as a hopping motion, but to make this a walk cycle, what we'll do is change one of the graphics to be offset or staggered. So let's select either symbol. I'm going to select the one on the left and go to the Properties panel to change the start frame. That's this field over here, next to the word first. Now, if we remember that our walk cycle is exactly 16 frames long, then we know exactly how much to offset it by half of the cycle. You might think that since half of 16 is 8, then start frame should be 8, but remember that the first frame starts at frame 1. And if we actually look at what frame 8 looks like, we can see on the timeline that we're not exactly halfway through our cycle. We should be on the first frame of the second half of this timeline, but instead we're on the last frame of the first half. All of this is because the first frame is called frame 1, not frame 0. If we want to give our left leg an offset of half of the whole cycle, we should start with 1 and then add 8 frames, giving us frame 9. Because of that, I'm going to change the leg on the left to have a start frame of 9. And now that we've used start frame to stagger the left leg by half a cycle, let's play it. Look at that. It's amazing how drastic of a change you can get just by adding staggering. It's like all of the slow parts get filled in, and now the whole motion is continuous. We have now made a perfectly usable walk cycle from scratch. That is no small feat. Our walk cycle so far is animated on 2s, which is a perfectly usable number of frames for a smooth-looking animation. The issue is that if we put these two symbols in a graphic and tween it, we get this jerky looking motion. That's caused by the way in which we're mixing our frame by frame motion, which is on 2s, with the classic tween, which is on 1s. One of the rules of walk cycles is that any convincing looking walk cycle has to avoid the issue of feet sliding. We can't let any foot that's touching the ground shift at all. If we leave our animation on 2s, it'll be impossible to make a tween that matches the more jerky motion of the frame by frame. What this means is if we want this walk cycle to be usable, we want to make sure it looks good tweened. That means our frame by frame animation has to be animated on 1s, so it'll move in sync with the tween moving. So what I did there was just undo making that symbol and tweening that symbol. I'm going to dive back into our walk cycle graphic and go to frame 2. For our first in-between, we're going to look at the position of the leg and the general shape of the foot across the previous and following keyframes. So I'll place a keyframe on frame 2, and we'll just modify the leg that's already there. I'm going to make this foot fall down a bit. Next, on frame 4, we're actually going to copy the keyframe that's after it and just try to match the midpoint of the leg angles while keeping the foot on the floor. Now, frame 6 is probably the most straightforward one, since the previous and following keyframes are the exact same symbol. In fact, let's try using a classic tween to get the exact midpoint. You can see how this classic tween has perfectly interpolated the green and the blue shapes here. Although, since skewing works kind of weirdly when it's tweened, let's actually add a keyframe and scale this back so that the foot still remains flat on the floor. Now, to add an in-between keyframe on frame 8, let's just try our best to make the leg angle and most of the foot motion look continuous, because there isn't really much we can do to change the way the heel is still completely flat on the floor, whereas on the next frame it's perfectly lifted. So we're just trying to match the general shape here. And then with frame 10, let's skew the existing scrunched leg to try to continue the leg rotation, even though the heel motion isn't really all that smooth here. Next, with frame 12, let's squash this existing straight leg to try to match this arc that's in the movement. Frame 14 is another simple one, since this symbol is leg bent above in both the before and after keyframes. So again, we can try using a classic tween here to try to help us find the midpoint, though I would add a keyframe to this one too. And that's to sort of maximize the upward curve that's going on here, as the leg curves upward like that. So this keyframe here is to maintain that arch that's happening. Finally, the last in-between keyframe. Now, it doesn't look like frame 16 is an in-between frame, but since we're making a loop, this frame's actually in between frame 15 and frame 1. So to help us see where this frame should be heading, let's actually copy frame 1 and paste it at the very end to serve as a guide. So I'm going to right-click on frame 1, copy frames, and then right-click on frame 17 and paste frames. Now, thanks to our onion skin, we can now see where we came from and where we'll be heading. And we can see what we're actually in-betweening. I actually think this last in-between should be a straight leg, so that way this leg doesn't ease out before easing in with the leftward motion. So I'm going to delete the contents of this in-between keyframe, copy this leg, and paste it in place, rotating it leftward a bit. So that way, this foot is finishing its rightward motion before heading back left again. And then I'm just going to remove this keyframe here. So now we have a fully in-between walk cycle. You just animated this thing on ones. That's the pinnacle of smoothness. Well done. And since you now know how to build this thing from scratch, you can actually make your own walk cycle of any length, not just 16 frames. How is a walk cycle different from a run cycle? Well, how is a walk different from a run? The speed, right? Isn't just running level 2 of walking? After all, if you need to get from point A to point B in less time, you're probably going to run, since that lets you cover more distance in less time. But the moment you speed up footage of someone walking, well, there's no way you're going to convince someone that this person is running, or that this is someone walking. What's become clear to us is that you can tell if someone's running or walking, regardless of the speed that the footage is being played at, and also regardless of the actual distance they're traveling. If we take a bunch of footage of people walking and running, and normalize the speed so that they're all taking steps at the same rate, it's still instantly obvious which people are running and which people are walking. What this means to us is that if we animated someone either running or walking, and someone else looked at how many frames long that looping motion was, the length wouldn't tell them anything that'll help them know whether the character is running or walking. If we want to make an animation where the audience can look at it and instantly know this person is walking instead of this person is running in slow motion, well, we have a few tricks in our toolbox that we can use to communicate that. Normalizing the speed of these walkers and runners helps us tune out the differences that might distract us from the parts that actually matter. Now, with all of these motions in sync, we can compare how their movements are different. And the most obvious difference is their posture. We could remove the motion entirely, and the people's poses would still tell us everything we need to know. The runners clearly have a much more exaggerated pose, and the bent arms and the lifted legs give it away. And the runners are also tilted forward. In comparison, the walkers are more upright, with the arms and legs remaining mostly vertical to save energy. Running is not an energy-saving motion, and most of the individual poses you'll see in a running person are less stable, since the body spends so much time on either 1 foot or 0 feet compared to 2 feet with walking. That brings us to another big difference, which is how much time the runners spend in the air compared to the walkers. There's so much vertical movement that each individual step is closer to a jump. It's the force of the back leg pushing against the ground that propels the runner upward, whereas with the walker, it's the front leg straightening out that causes the body to bounce upward slightly. Now, all of this real-life footage is going to look so much more subtle compared to a cartoon, which is made to be exaggerated. But understanding the real-life differences is going to help us stylize those differences, letting us communicate with the audience by making an animation that just feels like a walk, rather than a run or a jog. Now it's time for us to animate a run cycle. Even though there's a lot that's in common with the walk cycle, there's still a few key components that are going to be pretty different. Just like when we were first setting up the walk cycle, you'll start with the standard BFDI assets file and then trim all the layers down to 16 frames. So this run cycle is actually going to be the same length as our walk cycle. We'll add a new layer and rename it to leg. And once again, I'm going to remove these other layers. I'm going to bring in body parts, limbs, legs, legs straight. Zoom in and reset the transformation point by double-clicking it. First, we're going to lay down the main keyframes. Maybe I should call these the key keyframes. So our leg on frame 1 will start out by sticking straight forward like this. This is going to be when our runner is at the peak of their stride and both feet are in the air. One foot sticking as far forward as possible, and the other foot still recovering from pushing the ground backward. So after this, on frame 5, we'll add a keyframe to change this to a leg bent scrunched. I'm going to enable onion skin, and we'll rotate this downward. And try to squash and skew it, so it's like our runner is as low as possible, and they're in the middle of their bounce. Now, obviously, when you're running in real life, your body isn't going to be moving that low. But for the sake of our animation, we're going to exaggerate that up and down motion. So we're going to help the viewer see that bouncing motion that a walk cycle wouldn't have. But this leg isn't going to spend much time on the ground, since just 2 frames later, on frame 7, there will be another keyframe. I'll delete this leg and copy the straight leg from frame 1, paste it on frame 7, and change it to a leg bent above. And this is going to point backwards to a pretty extreme angle. That's for the peak of the running jump position, where one leg is sticking straight forward and the other one is recovering. Then for our last keyframe, I'll copy the one that's on frame 5, Command C, and paste it at frame 13. But I'll swap this scrunched leg with a leg bent above, and rotate it so it's mostly pointing forward. It's like our leg bent above is unfurling into a straight leg, like it's an inflatable slide, like on an airplane. And that's our 4 key keyframes. Already, the timing of the keyframes is pretty different from the walk cycle, really hinting at the power of each swipe as the leg pushes against the ground and pushes the body back into the air. We haven't added the pushing yet, but we will. We're going to smooth out this leg in one go, one pass. Unlike the walk cycle, we're not going to in-between it so it's animated on 2s, and then again so it's on 1s. Instead, we'll use tweens. We'll put a keyframe right before the second keyframe. So this will be on frame 4. I'm going to re-enable onion skin so we can get a better look at this. We'll skew this leg and then squash it a bit, rotating it so that it's pointing a little bit more in the direction of the squashed leg that comes after it, even if the shape is quite a bit different. We'll right-click frame 1 and give it a classic tween, with the easing set to cubic ease in. Then, for the span of 2 frames with the scrunched leg, we're just going to fill in the blank space in frame 6 by adding another keyframe. So since this symbol has the foot pushing against the ground, we want to skew the bottom of it to the left. It's like the foot is pushing the ground in that direction. And we can't really do that very easily since this transform rectangle is at such an awkward angle. We want a horizontal edge that we can drag to the left, but there isn't one. Here's another pro tip. If your transform rectangle is at an oblique angle, but you just want to transform it along horizontal and vertical axes, you can use the brush tool to add a secondary element, just temporarily. So I'm going to press B to activate the brush tool, and just create some temporary stroke here. And now if you select both your symbol and the new brush stroke, it'll give you a fresh new transform rectangle that you can scale or skew however you want. In this case, I'm actually going to bring the previous keyframe, this one here. I'm going to try to skew this a little bit more to the right, once again using the same trick. And afterward, you can just delete that temporary brush stroke. And the reason this works is because the thing you want to avoid, which is this strange transform rectangle, is because Adobe Animate is remembering what transformation that symbol has. So the transform tool will always show you this same rectangle. But if you select multiple of anything, even if I just duplicate this by holding Alt and dragging, and if I select both of these, Flash now treats it like something that doesn't have a transform, since there's multiple items, and they could all have their own transformations. I'm just going to undo that there. That was just for demonstration. And of course, you don't have to use the brush tool. I could drag in any random symbol. And now, the transform tool is giving me a rectangle with orthogonal axes. Just anything that temporarily gives you an extra element, something that'll make it so that you're selecting multiple items. That'll work. So anyway, now this second keyframe of the scrunch leg is now skewed to the left a bit. On to the next keyframe, which has leg bent above, pointing pretty far backward. We want to transition into this pose from this one. So let's add another keyframe at frame 9. And then go back to frame 7. And let's re-enable onion skin. And rotate this leg forward a bit. And then also skew it. So it's like this leg is emerging from the scrunched leg that came before it. And then we'll give frame 7 a classic tween, and change the easing to cubic ease out. So we have the bent leg swinging into place. Now let's transition it into the following keyframe, which is also a bent leg. And that means we can just convert this keyframe into a classic tween, and then give this new classic tween an ease of cubic ease in. Now, in my opinion, this is now swinging too low. We want to preserve the circular motion of the foot, so we need to raise this leg somehow during this tween. And the way we'll do that is by adding a keyframe during the tween. And then we'll use our pro tip from earlier. We'll use the brush tool to draw a temporary shape. somewhere within the bounds of this symbol, and then select them both. With the transform tool, we'll then squash it vertically, and I'm holding Alt so that it's transforming against the opposite edge. And this is to bring that foot upward and try to maintain that more circular motion. Now I'm going to remove this temporary shape. Now, after having the leg speed up as it reaches this midway position, we want to have it slow down into its final pose, which is just whatever it is on frame 1. That's the straight leg. Brace yourself, because we're about to use a weird trick that applies to animating a seamless loop. We're actually going to copy the contents of frame 1, and then create an empty keyframe on frame 14 by selecting it and pressing F7. Then we'll press Command-Shift-V or Control-Shift-V to paste in place, and then add another keyframe at frame 17. Frame 17, that's after the end of the loop. Why would we do that? We're going to see very soon. Now, using the onion skin previews, we'll rotate the incoming leg on frame 14 downward slightly, so that it's slightly more similar to the bent leg that came before it. And we'll give this second to last keyframe a classic tween with cubic ease out. The last thing we'll do is add a keyframe on frame 16, and then right-click frame 17 and remove frames. What we just did there by putting a keyframe one frame after the end is we've simulated the way that a graphic loops. If we look at frame 16, the leg is almost at its final position before it goes to the next frame, which is actually frame 1. By putting a sort of placeholder at frame 17, we made it possible to start a tween on frame 14 and end it on frame 1. If we had just copied frame 1 and pasted it into frame 16, this leg would be duplicated. We would end up having 2 different frames with the exact same drawing. So that's a weird little detail about animating a seamless loop. Anyway, we are now done with our run cycle. For good measure, let's put all of this in a graphic. We're going to select all of the frames for our leg, cut frames. Go to Insert, New Symbol, and let's name this Run Cycle and make sure type is set to graphic. Hit OK, and then we'll right-click on this one frame and paste frames. Now we have a run cycle symbol that we can reuse however we want. Now we have our finalized, finished run cycle graphic that we can use however we want. I want to show you this tool that I made for Chapter 5 of Object Animator's Toolbox. This is meant to show a walk cycle in a programmatic way, showing that a computer can follow some certain rules to make a walk cycle that just clicks and, looks right. But the issue is that a lot of these rules are so intuitive and so based on what feels right that it's actually pretty complicated to try to implement it in code. So what I did here was I used 2 different sine waves, offset, to create the circular motion. But what I did here was I flattened the bottom of the circle that was created. And the reason that I realized that this was not going to work was that when the foot is on the bottom, it should be moving at a linear pace, but I realized that I can't really have it work that way. It's harder than it looks to make computers simulate these things that we can do naturally ourselves. You can see there's a bunch of different parameters that you can change. In this case, I have this thing that's just labeled gate, but this slider controls at what level the circular motion is being flattened on the bottom. And throughout the whole thing, you can kind of see how the way that when a foot touches the ground, it doesn't move linearly, sort of permeates through the issues with this. So when this circle is almost entirely flattened, you can see the feet are sort of dragging on the ground. That is almost like the floor has no friction to it. Maybe one of the issues is that there's no reason that this should act like the physics of real life, that these should act like real feet with mass and friction. By attempting to sort of encode these physical parameters in a much more simple way makes me realize that now you're going to have to simulate the whole world if you want to try to simulate this thing in code. Now, the first slider actually doesn't do anything. I didn't program it to do anything, but the second one is what is going to set the size of that circle. That's the radius of the circular motion that these feet move in. Anyway, to conclude what I would like to say about this thing here, and that is an unfinished exploration into trying to code these problems, try to make programmatic solution to them. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work. Consider this an experiment. Sometimes the result isn't what you're expecting, but the fact that you got a result teaches you something. Now, you don't have to watch BFDI for very long to see that there are a lot of times where we just tween the body horizontally with the walk cycle legs tweened along with it. But in this course, we're going to do better than that. It's time to bring the body into the mix, because let's just imagine it. If you're going to be using this walk cycle or any run cycle, 10 times out of 10, there's going to be a body attached to it, and that body is going to have its own face layers. And a lot of the time, that face is going to be doing its own lip syncing on top of that. I just want to make sure you're prepared for that. Let's learn how to do that. I've set up this scenario where you're pretty likely to run into a similar thing. On these two layers down at the bottom are the graphics for the walk cycle that we made earlier. And then on the rest of these layers is where the rest of the body is. And we've got this wonderfully crafted facial animation where the whole upper body is pretty much how we want it. We just want to make this guy walk also. The first step is to select all of the frames across all of the layers of our upper body, so excluding the legs. And then right click and copy frames. We'll make a new symbol by going to Insert, New Symbol, or pressing Shift F8 and naming it Bob Container, and making sure type is set to graphic. Now we'll paste those frames inside and head back to the main timeline. We'll make a new layer and then go to the library and drag Bob Container onto the stage. Here we're going to try our best to line up the graphic to be in the same spot as the original layers. And with the graphic in place, we can now delete those layers. And we have no reason to worry since those layers are safely inside Bob Container. Now to make Bob Container bob up and down. Now we already know that our walk cycle is exactly 16 frames long, but some new information is that in the span of one walk cycle, we want the body to bob up and down twice. So we'll make a keyframe at frame 5, and then another one at frame 9. This will mark the motion of one bob. On frame 5, we'll use the arrow keys to move Bob Container downward a bit. And we can use onion skin at all times to see exactly how much we're moving this. Then we'll select these frames and create Classic Tween. These two tweens are going to have the easing, ease in out cubic. So now we've just created the tweens for one bob. One motion down and one motion up. Now this is the part where we run into a bit of a tricky situation, and a situation where I think it's a bit awkward with the way that Adobe Animate is designed. We want to loop the bobbing motion, but still continue the playback of our graphic, even throughout multiple loops of the bobbing motion. Now, as far as we know, the way to loop an animation is to put it inside a graphic. But if we do that, what we can instantly see is that the contents of that graphic get looped too. And there really isn't a way to opt out of that. We'll end up just seeing the first few frames of the graphic as the bobbing motion has reached its end, so now the whole thing jumps back to frame 1. Now, some users of Adobe Animate would solve this by switching the symbol type of Bob Container into a movie clip, which works differently from a graphic. A movie clip would loop through all of its frames with no regard for what start frame it's set to, since movie clips don't have start frames. They just progress through their own timeline, as if they have a mind of their own. Using the Properties panel to change Bob Container into a movie clip totally works, but within Object Animator's Toolbox, I don't recommend using animated movie clips, because the problem is that you can't see the animation when you're working on it. If you make Bob Container a movie clip, then Adobe Animate will only show you the first frame of it, even though when you go to render it, it'll display normally. It technically works, I just feel like animated movie clips can make things complicated to work with. That's why my solution is low-tech. We'll select the frames from the first keyframe to the last one, and then we'll press Command-Alt-C or Control-Alt-C to copy frames. And then we'll select the last keyframe and press Command-Alt-V or Control-Alt-V to paste frames. And we're just going to copy and paste as many frames as we need, just to cover the length of the walk that we're making. Now, if copy-pasting one bob over and over is too tedious, we can always double up. So each step, we just copy and paste double the number of keyframes, and that will cover ground a lot faster. And if we play what we have, we can see how it's still just repeating the frames of the first bob. What we're going to do to instantly fix that, with almost zero effort, is we're going to select across all of these tweens, just overlapping any part of those tweens. We'll go to the Properties panel and make sure to hit Sync Symbols. Now if we play it, we have now looped the bobbing motion while continuing the face motion. For the last step, let's now select all of the frames of the two legs and the Bob Container. Right-click, Copy Frames, and then go to Insert, New Symbol, and let's now just name this Walk Container. and paste frames. Then we'll go back to the main timeline and place walk container on the stage. We can choose to try to line it up with the original layers, but we don't really need to since we don't have a background here. And I'm going to remove the original versions of those layers. Now this is the part where we finally add that horizontal movement. I'll put a keyframe at frame, let's say frame 80, and move walk container to the right. Now I don't know exactly how much to the right, so I'll just guess. If we add a classic tween now, we can see how correct our guess was. If the feet slide in the same direction as the body, then you're moving walk container too fast, and you need to move the position in the final keyframe backward. And if they're sliding in the opposite direction as the body, then you're moving walk container too slow. So you would need to nudge the final keyframe forward. Task complete. We have now created a walking motion and a running motion, and then used that walking motion in a real walking scenario. This has been Chapter 5, Walk Cycles. Thank you so much for making it to the end. The next chapter is Chapter 6, which is about how to use camera angles and backgrounds. Thank you for making it to our final chapter, which is all about camera and backgrounds. Now, I've been looking back at our previous chapters, and I noticed that so far, the technique that's helped us out the most across all of our chapters, which we've used more than any other technique, has been the ability to contain symbols inside other symbols. From our first chapter, where we learned how to stagger our arm movement from the body, to the third chapter, where we simplified our timeline by containing a face, a body, and a mask into one symbol, to the fourth chapter, where we took nesting to its peak in order to make complex body movements. All of this has a common theme, and that theme is grouping the elements of a character's body. In this final chapter, we're going to take that to the next level. We're going to group not just the parts of a face or a character or even multiple characters. This is the chapter where we group the entire world that our characters live in. Welcome to Chapter 6, Camera and Background. Let's get started. I've reopened the animation we made in Chapter 5 when we animated a run cycle from scratch. In this page, we're going to give this run cycle a body and a location. That way, by the end, we'll have a looping background with a shaking camera. Now, the way that this run cycle file that we've opened is set up is that this top layer contains the two instances of a run cycle graphic. That's the run cycle that we animated ourselves in Chapter 5. So this layer has two instances of that graphic, where one instance has a start frame of 1, and the other one has a start frame so that it plays early by half of a cycle. Now the first thing we'll do is select these two symbols here, and then press F8, or modify convert to symbol. And we'll name this symbol running character, with type set to graphic. After that, we'll double-click into this new graphic and select frame 16. I'm going to press F5 to extend this new graphic to be able to play the whole run cycle. After that, I'm actually going to press F8 again, or hit Modify Convert to Symbol, and we'll name this one Body Container, once again with type set to graphic. I'm going to hit OK, and then we'll double-click into this graphic. You can see at the top here, we have this breadcrumb trail that shows that we are 2 levels deep. Not only are we inside of running character, but we're also inside of body container. Once again, we'll select frame 16 and press F5. And that's going to once again extend this to be able to play the whole run cycle. Now we'll add a layer above the legs. I'm going to resize this panel so that it's slightly smaller. We're going to bring in a character body from the BFDI assets. Now, I think we've done Blocky too many times, so we're going to choose a different character. In this case, I'm going to the library, and I'm navigating to find body parts, characters, and in this case, we're going to do golf ball. So I'm going to select golf ball quick and drag that onto the stage, onto our new higher layer. Now, this symbol golf ball quick is designed so that it's easy to set up a golf ball with a masked pattern to it. And that's what we've placed on the stage here. So this single symbol contains both the pattern and the mask used to contain this pattern, all within one symbol, unlike golf ball body, which just has the base circle shape. So this makes it a very convenient symbol to use if we're going to set up golf ball running. Next, we'll add a new layer above golf ball quick, and we'll build our character's face in this layer. So I'm actually going to navigate to find the face assets by going to eyes and then bringing in eye surprised right. And what I'll do to create the other eye is to hold Alt and Shift while dragging to duplicate it in a straight line. Now this one will select the swap symbol button and swap this with eye surprised left. After we transform these eyes to put them in the place that we want them, we'll bring in a mouth. So once again, in the library, I'm going to search for mouths inside of the folder called body parts. In this case, I'm going to bring in smile teeth big. That's the one that I consider to be appropriate for this project. And then I'm going to use the transform tool to transform it in the way that I want. So now we have 3 layers. On the top layer, we have our face. In the middle layer, we have golf ball quick. And on the bottom layer, we have the running motion that we created earlier. Now that was a lot of steps, but now we finished everything that we need inside of Body Container. We can play it and we can see that it's missing a component to it that we need. It's missing that vertical motion that a runner needs, and we're going to add that right now. We can't make our cool looking camera without a convincing looking subject. So I'm going to double click to exit out of Body Container, and now having exited out of that graphic, instead of being 2 graphics deep, we're now just 1 graphic deep, and we're editing the graphic called running character. I'm going to search for the frames where the feet are touching the floor. Those we want to freeze in place. So in this case, it's going to be frame 5 and frame 6, where I'm placing keyframes. And the same with frame 13 and frame 14. And now these same keyframes we can actually make to be the endpoints of our tweens. So if frame 6 is where our character leaves the ground, and frame 13 is where our character hits the ground once again, then we should place a keyframe at frame 9, let's say. And that'll be the peak of our character's jump. So I've got our zoom set to 200%, and I'm going to hold Shift and press the up arrow key. Now let's select a span of frames like this, overlapping this keyframe that we made. And then I'm going to right click and create classic tween, creating 2 classic tweens here. Now we'll select the first tween and go to the properties panel, where we'll change the ease to a cubic ease out, and then select the second tween and change that ease to a cubic ease in. So once again, the first tween is a cubic ease out, and the second tween is a cubic ease in. So now we've got one of our 2 jumps in our run cycle. Now the other jump is a little bit awkward since it crosses over the end and loops back to the beginning, but we've got a way to solve that. Let's move the playhead to frame 1, and then use Shift up arrow key to move our character to the peak. Then we'll right click this keyframe and create classic tween. And we're going to change this falling tween's ease to a cubic ease in. Now for the movement upwards, which is at the end of this loop, we're going to put a keyframe at frame 16 and then press Shift up arrow key again. But now we'll use down arrow key a couple of times since we're 1 frame before our character's peak. Yeah, somewhere around there should be good enough. Now we'll right click the second to last keyframe and create classic tween and change this tween's ease to a cubic ease out. Now we've animated our character jumping into this peak here before returning back to their standing position at the bottom here on frame 5. Alright, so now let's play what we've got. I'm going to enable the loop preview and drag this loop to cover the whole loop here. Look at that, we've now got a beautiful running motion. It'll go perfectly with our looping background, and that comes next. Now that we've set up the focal point of our animation, it's time to fill in the rest of our scene with some context. After all, even if you have the world's best running animation, your scene still won't be complete until you fill in everything that's not the runner. If you picture a runner in your head, or even if you search up actual photos of athletes performing, you're almost always going to see them in an athletic setting. I'm going to agree with you that animating a character alone is hard enough, but the thing that's too easy to forget is that without the things in the background to set the stage, all you've got are some moving shapes. It's the background and the setting where your character lives that transforms the piece from just an animation test to a scene with living, breathing characters. That's why for this runner, we need to add things for our character to run past. If we leave our character in the void and just have an empty space for our character to move, well then all we have are some disembodied body parts. Zombie legs and zombie bodies are just unnaturally brought to life. maybe we can trust the viewer to figure out things in their head, or to do the work of realizing that this is a character running through space. But if we add a place for this character to run, then maybe that'll help complete the illusion and make our animation look so much more convincing. If we complete this piece with a location for our character to run through, then maybe we don't need to wonder if our viewer can put the pieces together in their head. We can do that for them. Adding a convincing background is how we're going to ensure that our animation looks real. So what we'll do is we'll start by changing the dimensions of our stage. I'm going to resize this window to be more visible. But here in the properties panel, what we'll do is we'll make this stage square shaped. So we'll change the size from 640 by 360 to just 360 by 360. I'm going to exit back onto the main timeline, and we can see the change that's been made. Now, what we can see here is that the background's still sticking off the edge of our screen, but what I want to see is the actual square shape that it's going to look like. Now, Adobe Animate has this feature that's kind of hidden within all of its menus, but I use this feature so much that I've given it a keyboard shortcut. If we go to View, Magnification, Clip to Stage, that'll hide everything that's off the edges of our screen. It sounds kind of basic, but in my opinion, this is an essential part of making an animation. It's way too easy to draw things and create a beautiful background, only for it to get chopped off the edge of the stage. Now, the insidious part of working in any art program that lets you see off the edge of the stage is that you forget. You see the beautiful background that you've drawn, and you get lulled into a false sense of security that all the details you've added are going to be seen. But what we need to remember is that anything that's off the edge of the screen won't get seen. It sounds kind of obvious, but it's kind of hard to put into practice. Everything we do within Adobe Animate is to serve the final product, which is our animated video file. If we live inside of Adobe Animate and spend too much time in the program, it's way too easy to forget that not every shape is going to get seen. We can spend our time or exert our energy on something that'll just spend a 24th of a second on the screen, but if we draw anything outside of the edge of the screen, it'll just get thrown away. There's definitely value to drawing safe margins off the edge of the screen, but the reason I really recommend getting familiar with View, Magnification, Clip to Stage is so that we don't lose sight of the end result. We can't forget that this rectangle is everything our viewers are going to see. Now, with that said, I'm just going to disable Clip to Stage, just so that our stage is easier to work with. Now let's scale up our running character and put it in the right place to leave room for a horizon in the background. Then we'll choose a layer that's lower than our character. And in this case, I'm going to add a new layer. And we'll make sure that our stroke is set to no stroke, and that our fill is set to white. And with the rectangle tool selected, we'll draw a white rectangle to represent the ground. And I'm actually going to resize this so that our character's head is peeking over the edge of the horizon. And the reason we want the character's head to peek over the edge is just to give our scene some extra depth. Now I'll add a new layer above our white rectangle. So this is our white rectangle, and I'll add a new layer above that. We're going to change our toolbar's fill color to a light gray. In this case, it's going to have that hex code of 6 C's in a row. And I'm going to resize this window to show a new button that we'll see if we select the oval tool. Let's make sure that this button, Object Drawing, is not enabled but disabled. And now we're going to use the oval tool to draw some bushes. I like drawing from the center and holding Alt. But you don't have to do that. The most important part is to hold Shift to keep these ovals as circles and not as ovals with a different width than their height. Instead, we're just going to keep these as circles. And with the oval tool, with object drawing mode disabled, we're going to draw these bushes here. Maybe this bush is going to have 4 circles within it. That is our second bush. And we're just going to keep going until we have 4 bushes. And like that, that is 4 bushes. Finally, I'll select the whole layer and press F8 to convert it to a symbol. Let's just call this bushes and hit OK. Now, these 4 bushes are contained within one symbol. With the selection tool activated, I'll double click into this symbol and make one last change. Let's deselect everything, and I'm going to zoom out to fit everything within our viewport here. And I'm going to chop off the bottom edge by selecting a rectangle and then hitting backspace. Now, with nothing selected and the selection tool still activated, I'm going to add back some curvature by dragging these bottom edges downward. So you can see that I'm dragging within the middle of this edge to add a curve to it. Just like that, these bushes now have a curvature at the bottom of their chopped edge. And that'll add a natural curved edge, as if these bushes are pushed against the ground, but they're still bulging through the 3rd dimension. Finally, we can exit back to the main timeline. Now what we'll do is we'll make sure the selection tool is still active, and we'll hold down Alt and Shift while dragging the bushes symbol horizontally. And we'll drag this duplicate far enough to the right that it looks like an extra long row of bushes. Now we can select both of these instances and convert that to a symbol. We're going to call this tiled bushes, and I'll hit OK to convert these two instances into one symbol. Our next step is to animate this row of bushes to slide to the left over time. We want to contain this tweened motion inside of a graphic. So we'll select tiled bushes and convert that to a symbol by pressing F8. And we'll call this one moving tiled bushes, and type should be set to graphic. Now with this graphic created, let's double click inside of moving tiled bushes and add a keyframe at frame 17. Now we'll enable onion skin. What we're about to do is move our second keyframe far enough to the left that it's like one of the two bushes instances has gotten swapped with the other. So I'll hold Shift while dragging tiled bushes, and I'll line it up with our onion skin preview. Just like that. Now I can disable onion skin, and then right click somewhere after the first keyframe to create classic tween. That's our bush motion. Now, if I were to be on the last frame and I skipped back to the first frame, you can see how it's kind of like a relay race where one of the two instances gets swapped in with the other one. I'm going to resize this window once again to reveal this button here for loop preview. Now, if I enable the loop preview option and play this 17 frame timeline, what you can see here is that the bushes subtly freeze for an extra frame as the timeline loops over. And that's because what we've made has an extra frame. The part where one copy of the bushes gets swapped with the other copy is actually totally motionless, unlike the tweened motion in the rest of the timeline. That's why we've placed our second keyframe on frame 17 instead of frame 16. It's time now to select frame 16 and add a keyframe there. And then we'll right click frame 17 and remove frames. Now, if we play our 16 frame loop, we can see that the subtle pausing is gone and we've got a perfect loop. But of course, we can still see that jumping motion when the loop resets, so our loop actually isn't perfect at all. Let's disable the loop preview option and double click back out to the main timeline. The issue with our background is how the edge of our tiled background is still visible, so when it goes to reset, you can still see that edge jump into place. This is the reason why we made two copies of our bushes graphic. Since we have two perfect duplicates of our background, we're now able to hide that jumping transition by making sure that the one copy that's about to disappear is fully off the stage first, and that the place where the next copy is going to appear is also off the edge of the stage. Everything that I said about the edge of the stage, how it's so cruel that it throws away everything that we've drawn outside of it, that's now here to help us. What we'll do is we'll now move the playhead to frame 1, and we'll drag our moving tiled bushes graphic so that the left edge of the leftmost bush is off of the left edge of the screen, like that. Now, if we scrub the playhead to the last frame, hopefully our rightmost bush should also be off of the right edge of the screen. And if it's not, we can safely scale our entire tiled moving bushes graphic so that it's large enough for one copy of bushes to cover the whole width of the screen. So now, if we've made sure that the first frame has a bush bleeding off of the left edge, and the last frame has a bush crossing the right edge, then that means we should now have a seamlessly looping background. It's time, once again, to go to View, Magnification, Clip to Stage, and enable Loop Preview also, and drag that loop to cover the whole timeline so that we can see our looping background in its full beauty. Beautiful. We've now completed our full moving background, and it loops too. With the background and the whole scene to compare it to, our running character now looks like they're really moving fast. Can we take this background further? Can we take this to the next level? We can. Time to make this background 3D by adding parallax. That's when the camera's moving, so objects are moving across the screen, but far away objects are moving slower, whereas objects that are closer to the camera move faster. And then close-up objects move the fastest. Now, the specific way that we've set up this tiled moving bushes background has actually been made for this purpose. Time to add some extra depth to our scene by duplicating this tiled bushes graphic to make new layers of bushes. I'm going to disable View, Magnification, Clip to Stage just so we can see everything once again. With the Transform tool activated, we'll hold Alt and drag moving tiled bushes downward slightly. And then what we'll do is we'll hold Shift and then drag one of these corners of this transform rectangle to scale it a bit bigger. Because we've contained our bushes and the bushes movement inside the same symbol, we can actually enlarge the bushes and make them move faster in the same step. I'm actually going to open up the transform panel so we can manually set the scale to 200%. Now, we're free to position our closer bushes as high or low as we want, but the only restriction is that, once again, we can't let the left or the right edges of our tiled bushes to be visible. Because this graphic has two sets of bushes, we want to make sure that the swapping of one set with the other set is off screen. Let's bring the playhead to frame 1 just to be sure. Now, as long as the left edge of those bushes extends past the left edge of the screen, which it definitely is here, we can be sure that the bushes that disappear at the end of our loop are fully out of sight. So just like this, we can see how there isn't any foul play occurring within this black stroked rectangle. And I can even bring it closer like that. So now you can see here, this is really close to the edge here. And that first copy disappears, but it's still off the screen as it disappears. So now if I enable the loop preview option and I hide the edges of the screen by going to view magnification, clip to stage, you can see that swapping isn't visible at all. You can see there isn't any popping visible within the stage. All right, I'm going to disable that clip to stage option, and I'm also going to disable the loop preview option. Now, beautiful, we have 2 layers of bushes. It's now time to add a third one, and this one is going to be smaller. This is going to be one that's further away from the camera. Let's hold Alt and drag the original bushes upward a bit. They actually don't have that much room to move upward since we're already pretty close to the horizon here. You can barely see the horizon, but there it is there. So we don't want these bushes to be above the horizon. These are not floating bushes, these are natural bushes. So I'm gonna make sure that these bushes stay rooted within this white rectangle so that they don't go above the horizon. Now we'll scale it to be smaller. This is the part where we have to be careful. We only have so much room to shrink these bushes, since the most we can possibly show is the full group of 4 bushes. We don't want anything more than those 4 bushes to show up, because otherwise we're going to see some bushes disappear. Those 4 bushes are the safe region that we have. So I'm going to scale these down. I'm actually going to bring these off of the horizon just so we can see how much room we're working with. You can see that if I bring these 4 bushes to be small enough so that more than those 4 bushes show up, we actually are going to run into some popping here. Actually, I'm not really sure what's going on there. It looks like we have a little bit more than 4 bushes to work with. But just like that, we can scale them smaller. And the smaller we scale them, the more risk we run into of seeing that popping happen. So yeah, now you can see some popping occurring. As long as we can keep one set of these bushes within the stage, we should be safe. So you can see that this copy of the bushes here is about to disappear, but since it's fully off of the stage, it won't lead to any popping, and we're safe, just like that. Now, as one group of bushes disappears and teleports back to the right side, we need to make sure that the other group is still large enough to cover the whole screen in the meantime. So I'll hold Shift and shrink this graphic to the size that we want, while still being careful to make sure that those 4 bushes are wider than our canvas. And here they are, still wider than our canvas. Alright, so I'm going to drag this down once again to be a little bit more realistic, where the bushes are still on the ground and not above the horizon, like that. Boom. Look at that, 3 sets of bushes at what looks like 3 different depths. Now in front of this background that's outside of the stage, it's pretty easy to see the layers of bushes, but let's double check just so we can see what our viewer is actually going to see. We'll go to View, Magnification, Clip to Stage once again to shrink what we can see to just the canvas. That is all we can see. If we can limit what we see to just what the viewer sees, then I think that'll give us a much more realistic idea of what the final product is going to look like. Now, looking at it, it's kind of chaotic, it's kind of messy. Just within that canvas, we've got a lot going on, and it's kind of hard to tell what's happening. This is where we bring in another technique, fog. Now, some people call this atmospheric perspective, but I prefer fog. All this really is making faraway things hazier. It's making them more tinted to the color of the sky. That's why I'm so glad that we made each layer of bushes contained fully inside of a graphic. If we had left these as tweens, then we'd have to worry about changing both a start frame and an end frame. But since this is all contained within one thing, we can just change that and we don't have to worry about making other things change the same way just to match. Storing the whole motion inside of tweens has helped us a ton, letting us change both the size and the speed in one go. And now we get to change change the color in one go too. We'll select the furthest layer of bushes, so that's the smallest one here, and we'll point our eyes to the properties panel. Let's go to the color effects section, and we'll change the drop down from none to brightness. And by raising the slider to 100%, we can turn these bushes white, and that'll make their silhouettes really stand out. But instantly we can see a problem here. Our bushes all being the same color actually hid something from us. Those bushes that were supposed to be the furthest back actually were in front of all the other bushes the whole time. So the way we'll solve this is by right-clicking this instance and going to Arrange, Send to Back, or by pressing Command-Shift down arrow or Control-Shift down arrow. Now our faraway bushes look like they're distant silhouettes, which stands out super nicely from both the sky and the middle row of bushes. Time to bring out the frontmost bushes. Let's select the largest graphic and go to Color Effects, Brightness, and bring down the brightness slider pretty much to give the opposite effect as the faraway bushes. Now, even though it might not be realistic, making things that are close to the camera be darker is a super easy way to give them a super defined silhouette, and that'll really add a sense of depth to your scene. It's kind of like you filmed something super close, like so close that your camera was casting a shadow on that object. It definitely doesn't apply to all scenes, especially not this one where our character is even closer than the bushes are, but making closer things darker is just another tool you can add to your tool belt. In this case, I actually think that a dark gray looks kind of boring and dry. So I'll actually switch our color effect from brightness to tint and give this a sort of bluish greenish color. This one, there we go. Now, all three layers of our bushes have these clearly defined silhouettes. Even when we use the clip to stage option to restrict our vision and see just what the viewer sees, it's still easier than ever to see what's what. And that's all because we've changed the colors to bring out these silhouettes. So now we have a perfectly crafted 3D looping background. Time to add the final puzzle piece. The thing that'll tie this all together is a subtle camera shake. In the next page, we're going to go over the simplest, most useful way to add emphasis to a scene by adding camera shake. The steps that I'm going to show you are the ones that you can whip out and use in any situation to instantly add a sense of action or movement to a scene. If your animation feels still or lifeless, when you'd like to give off a sense that, whoa, something's happening, then something you can add is camera shake. This is when you change a scene from one that has a stable camera to one where the camera is constantly moving, subtly. Even though there's no noticeable beginning or end to this camera motion, and no point in time where you can pick out which way the camera's moving, the constant motion of this camera breaks up the feeling of solidness when the camera's perfectly still. If you've got an animation where you want things to move in a more natural way, to give off a more in the wild kind of look, like someone just whipped out their phone and started filming, then maybe a camera shake is what you need. We're going to add a camera shake. This part is all about adding chaos to an otherwise static animation, but in order for that to be noticeable, we need to add things that the viewer will know are static. That way the viewer's eye has something to compare to, and something that'll help the viewer notice that our camera is shaking. Now, from looking at our animation, we can see that the parallax effect we've made, where some bushes are moving faster than others, and the further away bushes are moving slower, gives a major hint as to where the camera is and where it's pointing. The next step we can take to really lock in the pattern of fast, medium, slow for each row of bushes is to add an unmoving fourth layer. That's going to be the sky, which is infinitely far away. Technically, our character's running is causing them to move past the sun and the clouds, but we're going to give the impression that they're so far away that any amount our character runs doesn't matter. And that's going to really sell the depth effect we're going for. So we'll create a new layer beneath our white rectangle. And we'll use the oval tool to draw a white circle. And that'll act as our sun. I'm just going to position it there. Next, we'll add some clouds. Now, to match the abstract style of our animation so far, we're going to make them white stripes that cross over the whole screen. We'll activate the rectangle tool and change the toolbar's fill color to a white color that's 50% transparent. Now we'll draw some stripes. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to make the ones that are closer to the camera start out wider, but then become narrower as they approach the horizon. So I'm going to leave an empty space for the sun, but you can see that the rectangle at the top is the thickest, and the ones near the horizon are thinner. Like that, I have now drawn 3 stripes. Even when our background is so abstract, we can still use the rules of perspective to communicate what we want. In this case, it's a flat plane representing the layer of clouds in the sky. Now, with our clouds and our sun in place, let's add one more static object. That's going to be the shadow underneath our character. Since the running is causing them to bounce up and down, it's kind of hard to tell where they are relative to the ground. That's the job of the shadow that we're going to add. Let's find our character, which is on the topmost layer. We'll add a new layer, which will be directly underneath the top layer. I'm going to change our fill color to be 20% opaque. And then we'll make this fill color a sort of dark bluish color. Now, with the oval tool activated, I'm going to draw an ellipse in our new layer, and I'm going to hold Alt to draw from the center of it. We want it to be aligned with the center of our character's body, since that's the part that's doing the most to contribute to that shadow on the ground. Now, I can scrub through our frames to see where our character's feet make contact with the ground. Like that. And we can use that as a guide for positioning our shadow. Now we have our scene fully set up with static elements that are going to show off our shaking camera super clearly. Let's select all of our frames across all of the layers, right click and copy frames. Now we'll go to Insert, New Symbol, and name this symbol Running Scene with type set to graphic. We'll right click on the empty frame and paste frames. Now we'll exit back to the main timeline, make a new layer, open up the library, and drag our running scene symbol onto the stage. Now let's try to align it with our original layers. I'm going to disable this clip to stage option just so we can see things super clearly. And we're going to align this symbol with the original layers that made it up. Finally, we can select all of those original layers and delete them, leaving just our new symbol. Now we have everything in one symbol, which we can transform and rotate and scale however we want. Let's select all of the frames on this layer and then press F6 to convert those frames into keyframes. Time to finally add that shaking motion. Here's a super quick way to do that. We'll move our playhead to frame 1. And we'll select our graphic, and then randomly mash the arrow keys. Then we'll move to the next frame by pressing the greater than key, or the period key, and we'll click on our graphic and once again mash the arrow keys. We'll continue this cycle of advancing to the next frame by pressing the greater than key, clicking on our graphic and mashing the arrow keys until we've gotten to the last frame. We're using our keyboard mashing as a random number generator. In my opinion, that's pretty wild. We're taking entropy from the real world and feeding that into our animation. Now, after we've gone through all of our frames, we can play our animation. And look at that. That animation we've just made is one of a kind. There will never be another animation like it. Well done. Our shaky running animation is complete. And if you want, you can add motion lines or any other details you like. It's time for a more interesting camera shake that you can make by using what I'm going to call the countdown technique. I've opened up the blocky jumping animation from Chapter 4, Body Movements, because I think there's something more we can add to really make this jump look more exciting and epic. Now, you don't have to use this exact animation. You can make your own animation of some character landing on the ground, and it'll totally work for this section. We want to make this landing feel super powerful, like this impact has just hit the ground so hard that this person holding the camera gets knocked off their feet. The thing is, unlike the last camera shake we made, this unsteady motion is going to be in one direction. The camera shake that we're about to make has the camera swinging up and down a number of times before the swinging motion essentially fades out. The first thing I'll do is add a new layer and drag it to the bottom. I'll draw a white rectangle to represent the ground. And any other details I add to this layer are just going to be part of our background. What we're doing by adding a background here is just adding more details that we can use to see this camera motion. Now with our background layer done, we should now have a few different layers. Some of them are going to be different parts of our character, while one of them is for the background. We'll select the top layer and hold Shift while selecting the bottom layer to select all of these different layers, and then we'll cut frames. Then we'll go to Insert, New Symbol, and I'll name this Impact Container. And make sure that type is set to graphic. I'll click OK, and then I'll right click the empty frame and paste frames. Finally, exiting back onto the main timeline, we'll add a new layer and drag Impact Container onto the stage. And we'll try to align it to match what our original layers looked like. And then I'll remove those original layers. Now we'll search for the frame where our character's feet first make contact with the ground. That's the frame where our impact is the strongest, and all the layers after that only grow weaker. And that's going to be on frame 13. Because when you've got an impact like this, the most important part is the first frame, or the first few frames. That's where the original energy of that thing that's making the impact unleashes all of its energy into the camera, essentially. And any movement that happens after that is the original movement sort of continuing until it finally wears off and disappears. We'll select the frames starting with frame 13 and then ending on frame 23, and then press F6 to convert them into keyframes. This is where the countdown comes into play. To represent that first powerful impact, let's select the first of these keyframes, and then press the down arrow key 5 times. Then we'll select the second keyframe and press the up arrow key 5 times. After that, we'll select the next keyframe and press the down arrow key 4 times. And then select the next keyframe and press up 4 times. So each keyframe gets moved less and less compared to the keyframe before it. Now let's finish off this whole string of keyframes. We'll move this keyframe down 3 times, and this one up 3 times, and then down 2 times, and up 2 times, and then down 1, and finally up 1. And that means the last keyframe is untouched. So now if we play this, you can see how natural that camera shake is, how it bounces up and down but then fades away over the course of multiple bounces. And we managed to do that by first making a series of keyframes and then nudging them with the arrow keys. The first one getting nudged the most and then counting down to keep track of how to nudge it less over time. And if I move the playhead to the last keyframe, click the colored rectangle here to switch this layer to outline mode, and then enable onion skin, you can see how our countdown technique created an equal number of keyframes that were nudged above and below our original location. And if we step through these frames, we can see that container graphic bouncing up and down less and less each time before settling in the middle. I'm going to disable onion skin and take this layer out of outline mode. I actually think this camera shake is too short, and not only does it decay too soon, but those individual bounces are too fast to be realistic. Let's go over a rule that I'm going to introduce when you're dealing with a camera in Adobe Animate. When you make a virtual camera by putting your scene inside of a container graphic, that graphic must include everything that the camera sees, including the background and the sky. And anything that's not in real life is going to stay outside the symbol and be layered on top. Things like this include motion lines, darkened edges, which is also called a vignette, and graphics and text that are on the screen. Now, things that aren't necessarily real but are still attached to objects, like glowing gradients, light rays, pointers, and speech bubbles, those things still make sense to include inside your container, just so it's easier to keep them synchronized with whatever real-life thing it's attached to. Now, imagine a single graphic containing 2 characters. If we cut between the 2 characters, sometimes it can be hard to tell where one is compared to the other. When that cut happens, the viewer might think, where am I now? Where was I earlier? We can communicate a lot more to the viewer if we smoothly move it, and since they're on the same canvas, the way we move the graphic is a no-brainer. Now, a lot of the time you won't be able to put all your characters in the same canvas. Our characters might be on 2 different backgrounds. However, we can still give the illusion that our characters are in the same room by faking that same sweep of the camera. The sneaky thing we'll do is when the camera is moving the fastest, we'll switch the first background with the second one. The key to this technique is that both the before and after graphics move in the same direction. This is a useful technique that I think that you can employ in any animation that you make. I'm just filming this right now off the top of my head. Well done for making it to the end of Object Animator's Toolbox. You have done an amazing job, and the fact that you made it to the end is just incredible. I just want to say thank you so much for making it to the end and going through every chapter. I really appreciate it. I don't know what else to say, but thank you. This has been Michael Huang, and I'll see you next time.